Chapter 10. The recognition of our own mistakes should not benefit us any more than the study of our successes. But there is a natural tendency in all men to avoid punishment. When you associate certain mistakes with a licking, you do not hanker for a second dose. And, of course, all stock market mistakes wound you in two tender spots: your pocketbook and your vanity. But I will tell you something curious. A stock speculator sometimes makes mistakes and knows that he is making them. And after he makes them, he will ask himself why he made them. And after thinking over it cool-bloodedly, a long time after the pain of punishment is over, he may learn how he came to make them, and when, and at what particular point of his trade, but not why. And then he simply calls himself names and lets it go at that. Of course, if a man is both wise and lucky, he will not make the same mistake twice, but he will make any one of the 10,000 brothers or cousins of the original. The mistake family is so large that there is always one of them around when you want to see what you can do in the fool play line. To tell you about the first of my million-dollar mistakes, I shall have to go back to this time when I first became a millionaire, right after the big break of October, 1907. As far as my trading went, having $1 million merely meant more reserves. Money does not give a trader more comfort because, rich or poor, he can make mistakes, and it is never comfortable to be wrong. And when a millionaire is right, his money is merely one of his several servants. Losing money is the least of my troubles. A loss never bothers me after I take it. I forget it overnight. But being wrong, not taking the loss, that is what does the damage to the pocketbook and to the soul. You remember Dixon G. Watts's story about the man who was so nervous that a friend asked him what was the matter. "I can't sleep," answered the nervous one. "Why not?" asked the friend. "I'm carrying so much cotton that I can't sleep thinking about it. It is wearing me out. What can I do?" "Sell down to the sleeping point," answered the friend. As a rule, a man adapts himself to conditions so quickly that he loses the perspective. He does not feel the difference much. That is, he does not vividly remember how it felt not to be a millionaire. He only remembers that there were things he could not do that he can do now. It does not take a reasonably young and normal man very long to lose the habit of being poor. It requires a little longer to forget that he used to be rich. I suppose that is because money creates needs or encourages their multiplication. I mean that after a man makes money in the stock market, he very quickly loses the habit of not spending. But after he loses his money, it takes him a long time to lose the habit of spending. After I took in my shorts and went long in October 1907, I decided to take it easy for a while. I bought a yacht and planned to go off on a cruise in southern waters. I am crazy about fishing, and I was due to have the time of my life. I looked forward to it and expected to go any day. But I did not. The market wouldn't let me. I always have traded in commodities as well as in stocks. I began as a youngster in the bucket shops. I studied those markets for years, though perhaps not so assiduously as the stock market. As a matter of fact, I would rather play commodities than stocks. There is no question about their greater legitimacy, as it were. It partakes more of the nature of a commercial venture than trading in stocks does. A man can approach it as he might any mercantile problem. It may be possible to use fictitious arguments for or against a certain trend in a commodity market, but success will be only temporary, for in the end, the facts are bound to prevail, so that a trader gets dividends on study and observation, as he does in a regular business. He can watch and weigh conditions, and he knows as much about it as anyone else. He need not guard against inside clicks. Dividends are not unexpectedly passed or increased overnight in the cotton market or in wheat or corn. In the long run, commodity prices are governed but by one law, the economic law of demand and supply. The business of the trader in commodities is simply to get facts about the demand and the supply, present in perspective. He does not indulge in guesses about a dozen things as he does in stocks. It always appealed to me, trading in commodities. Of course, the same things happen in all speculative markets. The message of the tape is the same. That will be perfectly plain to anyone who will take the trouble to think. He will find, if he asks himself questions and considers conditions, that the answers will supply themselves directly. But people never take the trouble to ask questions, leave alone seeking answers. The average American is from Missouri everywhere, and at all times, except when he goes to the broker's offices and looks at the tape, whether it is stocks or commodities. The one game of all games that really requires study before making a play is the one he goes into without his usual, highly intelligent preliminary and precautionary doubts. He will risk half his fortune in the stock market with less reflection than he devotes to the selection of a medium-priced automobile. This matter of tape reading is not so complicated as it appears. Of course, you need experience, but it is even more important to keep certain fundamentals in mind. To read the tape is not to have your fortune told. The tape does not tell you how much you will surely be worth next Thursday at 1:35 p.m. The object of reading the tape is to ascertain first how and next when to trade, that is, whether it is wiser to buy than to sell. It works exactly the same for stocks as for cotton or wheat or corn or oats. You watch the market, that is, the course of prices as recorded by the tape, with one object: to determine the direction, that is, the price tendency. Prices, we know, will move either up or down according to the resistance they encounter. For purposes of easy explanation, we will say that prices, like everything else, move along the line of least resistance. They will do whatever comes easiest. Therefore, they will go up if there is less resistance to an advance than to a decline, and vice versa. Nobody should be puzzled as to whether a market is a bull market or a bear market after it fairly starts. The trend is evident to a man who has an open mind and reasonably clear sight, for it is never wise for a speculator to fit his facts to his theories. Such a man will, or ought to, know whether it is a bull or a bear market, and if he knows, that he knows whether to buy or to sell. It is therefore at the very inception of the movement that a man needs to know whether to buy or to sell. Let us say, for example, that the market, as it usually does in those between swings times, fluctuates within a range of 10 points, up to 130 and down to 120. It may look very weak at the bottom, or, on the way up, after a rise of 8 or 10 points, it may look as strong as anything. A man ought not to be led into trading by tokens. He should wait until the tape tells him that the time is ripe. As a matter of fact, millions upon millions of dollars have been lost by men who bought stocks because they looked cheap, or sold them because they looked dear. The speculator is not an investor. His object is not to secure a steady return on his money at a good rate of interest, but to profit by either a rise or a fall in the price of whatever he may be speculating in. Therefore, the thing to determine is the speculative line of least resistance at the moment of trading, and what he should wait for is the moment when that line defines itself, because that is his signal to get busy. Reading the tape merely enables him to see that at 1:30, the selling had been stronger than the buying, and a reaction in the price logically followed. Up to the point where the selling prevailed over the buying, superficial students of the tape may conclude that the price is not going to stop short of 150, and they buy. But after the reaction begins to hold on or sell out at a small loss, or they go short and talk bearish. But at 120, there is stronger resistance to the decline. The buying prevails over the selling. There is a rally and the shorts cover. The public is so often whipsawed that one marvels at their persistence in not learning their lesson. Eventually something happens that increases the power of either the upward or the downward force, and the point of greatest resistance moves up or down. That is, the buying at 130 will for the first time be stronger than the selling, or the selling at 120 be stronger than the buying. The price will break through the old barrier or movement limit and go on. As a rule, there is always a crowd of traders who are short at 120 because it looks so weak, or long at 130 because it looks so strong. And, when the market goes against them, they are forced, after a while, either to change their minds and turn or to close out. In either event, they help to define even more clearly the price line of least resistance. Thus, the intelligent trader who has patiently waited to determine this line will enlist the aid of fundamental trade conditions and also of the force of the trading of that part of the community that happened to guess wrong and must now rectify mistakes. Such corrections tend to push prices along the line of least resistance. And right here, I will say that, though I do not give it as a mathematical certainty or as an axiom of speculation, my experience has been that accidents, that is, the unexpected or unforeseen, have always helped me in my market position whenever the latter has been based upon my determination of the line of least resistance. Do you remember that Union Pacific episode of Saratoga that I told you about? Well, I was long, because I found out that the line of least resistance was upward. I should have stayed long instead of letting my broker tell me that insiders were selling stocks. It didn't make any difference what was going on in the directors' minds. That was something I couldn't possibly know. But I could and did know that the tape said, going up. And then came the unexpected raising of the dividend rate and the 30-point rise in the stock. At 164 prices looked mighty high, but as I told you before, stocks are never too high to buy or too low to sell this. The price eggs, per se, has nothing to do with establishing my line of least resistance. You will find in actual practice that if you trade as I have indicated any important piece of news given out between the closing of one market and the opening of another is usually in harmony with the line of least resistance. The trend has been established before the news is published, and in bull markets bear items are ignored and bull news exaggerated, and vice versa. Before the war broke out, the market was in a very weak condition. There came the proclamation of Germany's submarine policy. I was short 150,000 shares of stock, not because I knew the news was coming, but because I was going along the line of least resistance. What happened came out of a clear sky as far as my play was concerned. Of course, I took advantage of the situation and I covered my shorts that day. It sounds very easy to say that all you have to do is to watch the tape, establish your resistance points, and be ready to trade along the line of least resistance as soon as you have determined it. But in actual practice, a man has to guard against many things, and most of all, against himself. That is, against human nature. That is the reason why I say that the man who is right always has two forces working in his favor: basic conditions and the men who are wrong. In a bull market, bear factors are ignored. That is human nature, and yet human beings profess astonishment at it. People will tell you that the wheat crop has gone to pot because there has been bad weather in one or two sections and some farmers have been ruined. When the entire crop is gathered and all the farmers in all the wheat-growing sections begin to take their wheat to the elevators, the bulls are surprised at the smallness of the damage. They discover that they merely have helped the bears. When a man makes his play in a commodity market, he must not permit himself set opinions. He must have an open mind and flexibility. It is not wise to disregard the message of the tape, no matter what your opinion of crop conditions or of the probable demand may be. I recall how I missed a big play just by trying to anticipate the starting signal. I felt so sure of conditions that I thought it was not necessary to wait for the line of least resistance to define itself. I even thought I might help it arrive, because it looked as if it merely needed a little assistance. I was very bullish on cotton. It was hanging around 12 cents, running up and down within a moderate range. It was in one of those in-between places and I could see it. I knew I really ought to wait. But I got to thinking that if I gave it a little push, it would go beyond the upper resistance point. I bought 50,000 bales. Sure enough, it moved up. And sure enough, as soon as I stopped buying it, stopped going up. Then it began to settle back to where it was when I began buying it. I got out and it stopped going down. I thought I was now much nearer the starting signal, and presently, I thought I'd started myself again. I did. The same thing happened. I bid it up, only to see it go down when I stopped. I did this 4 or 5 times until I finally quit in disgust. It cost me about $200,000. I was done with it. It wasn't very long after that when it began to go up, and never stopped till it got to a price that would have meant a killing for me, if I hadn't been in such a great hurry to start. This experience has been the experience of so many traders so many times that I can give this rule. In a narrow market, When prices are not getting anywhere to speak of, but move within a narrow range, there is no sense in trying to anticipate what the next big movement is going to be. Up or down. The thing to do is to watch the market, read the tape to determine the limits of the get-nowhere prices, and make up your mind that you will not take an interest until the price breaks through the limit in either direction. A speculator must concern himself with making money out of the market, and not with insisting that the tape must agree with him. Never argue with it or ask it for reasons or explanations. Stock market post-mortems don't pay dividends. Not so long ago, I was with a party of friends. They got to talking wheat. Some of them were bullish and others bearish. Finally, they asked me what I thought. Well, I had been studying the market for some time. I knew they did not want any statistics or analyses of conditions. So I said, if you want to make some money out of wheat, I can tell you how to do it. They all said they did, and I told them, if you are sure you wish to make money in wheat, just you watch it. Wait, the moment it crosses $1.20, buy it and you will get a nice quick play in it. Why not buy it now at $1.14? One of the party asked. Because I don't know yet that it is going up at all. Then why buy it at $1.20? Seems a mighty high price. Do you wish to gamble blindly in the hope of getting a great big profit? Or do you wish to speculate intelligently and get a smaller, but much more probable profit? They all said they wanted the smaller, but surer profit. So I said, then do as I tell you. If it crosses $1.20, buy. As I told you, I had watched it a long time. For months, it sold between $1.10 and $1.20, getting nowhere in particular. Well, sir, one day it closed at above $1.19. I got ready for it. Sure enough, the next day it opened at $1.25, and I bought. Went to $1.21, to $1.22, to $1.23, to $1.25, and I went with it. Now, I couldn't have told you at the time just what was going on. I didn't get any explanations about its behavior during the course of the limited fluctuations. I couldn't tell whether the breaking through the limit would be up through $1.20 or down through $1.10, though I suspected it would be up because there was not enough wheat in the world for a big break in prices. As a matter of fact, it seems Europe had been buying quietly, and a lot of traders had gone short of it at around $1.19. Owing to the European purchases and other causes, a lot of wheat had been taken out of the market. So finally, the big movement got started. The price went beyond the $1.20 mark. That was all the point I had, and it was all I needed. I knew that when it crossed $1.20, it would be because the upward movement at last had gathered force to push it over the limit, and something had to happen. In other words, by crossing $1.20, the line of least resistance of wheat prices was established. It was a different story then. I remember that one day was a holiday with us and all our markets were closed. Well, in Winnipeg, wheat opened up 6 cents a bushel. When our market opened on the following day, it also was up 6 cents a bushel. The price just went along the line of least resistance. What I have told you gives you the essence of my trading system as based on studying the tape. I merely learned the way prices are most probably going to move. I checked up my own trading by additional tests to determine the psychological moment. I do that by watching the way the price acts after I begin. It is surprising how many experienced traders there are who look incredulous when I tell them that when I buy stocks for a rise, I like to pay top prices, and when I sell, I must sell low or not at all. It would not be so difficult to make money if a trader always stuck to his speculative guns. That is, waited for the line of least resistance to define itself, and began buying only when the tape said up, or selling only when it said down. He should accumulate his line on the way up. Let him buy 1/5 of his full line. If that does not show him a profit, he must not increase his holdings because he has obviously begun wrong. He is wrong temporarily, and there is no profit in being wrong at any time. The same tape that said UP did not necessarily lie merely because it is now saying not yet. In cotton, I was very successful in my trading for a long time. I had my theory about it, and I absolutely lived up to it. Suppose I had decided that my line would be 40 to 50,000 bales. Well, I would study the tape as I told you, watching for an opportunity either to buy or to sell. Suppose the line of least resistance indicated a bull movement. Well, I would buy 10,000 bales. After I got through buying that, if the market went up 10 points over my initial purchase price, I would take on another 10,000 bales. Same thing. Then, if I could get 20 points profit, or $1 a bale, I would buy 20,000 more. That would give me my line, my basis for my trading. But if after buying the first 10 or 20,000 bales, it showed me a loss, out I'd go. I was wrong. It might be I was only temporarily wrong. But as I have said before, it doesn't pay to start wrong in anything. What I accomplished by sticking to my system was that I always had a line of cotton in every real movement. In the course of accumulating my full line, I might chip out $50,000 or $60,000 in these feeling out plays of mine. This looks like a very expensive testing, but it wasn't. After the real movement started, how long would it take me to make up the $50,000 I had dropped in order to make sure that I began to load up at exactly the right time? No time at all. It always pays a man to be right at the right time. As I think I also said before, this describes what I may call my system for placing my bets. It is simple arithmetic to prove that it is a wise thing to have the big bet down, only when you win, and when you lose, to lose only a small exploratory bet, as it were. If a man trades in the way I have described, he will always be in the profitable position of being able to cash in on the big bet. Professional traders have always had some system or other based upon their experience, and governed either by their attitude toward speculation or by their desires. I remember I met an old gentleman in Palm Beach whose name I did not catch, or did not at once identify. I knew he had been in the street for years, way back in Civil War times, and somebody told me that he was a very wise old codger who had gone through so many booms and panics that he was always saying there was nothing new under the sun, and least of all in the stock market. The old fellow asked me a lot of questions. When I got through telling him about my usual practice in trading, he nodded and said, Yes, you're right. The way you're built, the way your mind runs, makes your system a good system for you. It comes easy for you to practice what you preach, because the money you bet is the least of your cares. I recollect Pat Hearn. Ever hear of him? Well, he was a very well-known sporting man, and he had an account with us. Clever chap, and nervy. He made money in stocks, and that made people ask him for advice. He would never give any. If they asked him point blank for his opinion about the wisdom of their commitments, he used a favorite racetrack maxim of his: You can't tell till you bet. He traded in our office. He would buy 100 shares of some active stock, and when, or if, it went up 1%, he would buy another 100. On another point's advance, another 100 shares, and so on. He used to say he wasn't playing the game to make money for others, and therefore, he would put in a stop-loss order 1 point below the price of his last purchase. When the price kept going up, he simply moved up his stop with it. On a 1% reaction, he was stopped out. He declared he did not see any sense in losing more than 1 point, whether it came out of his original margin or out of his paper profits. You know, a professional gambler is not looking for long shots, but for sure money. Of course, long shots are fine when they come in. In the stock market, Pat wasn't after tips or playing to catch 20 points a week advances, but sure money in sufficient quantity to provide him with a good living. Of all the thousands of outsiders that I have run across in Wall Street, Pat Hearn was the only one who saw in stock speculation merely a game of chance like faro or roulette, but nevertheless had the sense to stick to a relatively sound betting method. After Hearn's death, one of our customers who had always traded with Pat and used his system made over $100,000 in Lackawanna. Then he switched over to some other stock, and because he had made a big stake, he thought he need not stick to Pat's way. When a reaction came, instead of cutting short his losses, he let them run, as though they were profits. Of course, every cent went, When he finally quit, he owed us several $1,000s. He hung around for 2 or 3 years. He kept the fever long after the cash had gone. But we did not object, as long as he behaved himself. I remember that he used to admit freely that he had been 10,000 kinds of an ass not to stick to Pat Hearn's style of play. Well, one day, he came to me greatly excited and asked me to let him sell some stock short in our office. He was a nice enough chap who had been a good customer in his day, and I told him I personally would guarantee his account for 100 shares. He sold short 100 shares of Lakeshore. That was the time Bill Travers hammered the market in 1875. My friend Roberts put out that Lakeshore at exactly the right time and kept selling it on the way down, as he had been wont to do in the old successful days before he forsook Pat Hearn's system and instead listened to Hope's whispers. Well, sir, in 4 days of successful pyramiding, Roberts' account showed him a profit of $15,000. Observing that he had not put in a stop-loss order, I spoke to him about it, and he told me that the break hadn't fairly begun, and he wasn't going to be shaken out by any one-point reaction. This was in August. Before the middle of September, he borrowed $10 from me for a baby carriage, his fourth. He did not stick to his own proof system. That's the trouble with most of them. And the old fellow shook his head at me. And he was right. I sometimes think that speculation must be an unnatural sort of business, because I find that the average speculator has arrayed against him his own nature. The weaknesses that all men are prone to are fatal to success in speculation. Usually those very weaknesses that make him likable to his fellows, or that he himself particularly guards against in those other ventures of his, where they are not nearly so dangerous as when he is trading in stocks or commodities. The speculator's chief enemies are always boring from within. It is inseparable from human nature to hope and to fear. In speculation, when the market goes against you, you hope that every day will be the last day, and you lose more than you should had you not listened to hope. To the same ally that is so potent a success bringer to empire builders and pioneers, big and little. And when the market goes your way, you become fearful that the next day will take away your profit and you get out too soon. Fear keeps you from making as much money as you ought to. The successful trader has to fight these two deep-seated instincts. He has to reverse what you might call his natural impulses. Instead of hoping, he must fear. Instead of fearing, he must hope. He must fear that his loss may develop into a much bigger loss, and hope that his profit may become a big profit. It is absolutely wrong to gamble in stocks the way the average man does. I have been in the speculative game ever since I was 14. It is all I have ever done. I think I know what I am talking about, and the conclusion that I have reached after nearly 30 years of constant trading, both on a shoestring and with millions of dollars back of me, is this: a man may beat a stock or a group at a certain time, but no man living can beat the stock market. A man may make money out of individual deals in cotton or grain, but no man can beat the cotton market or the grain market. It's like the track. A man may beat a horse race, but he cannot beat horse racing. If I knew how to make these statements stronger or more emphatic, I certainly would. It does not make any difference what anybody says to the contrary. I know I am right in saying these are incontrovertible statements. Chapter 11. And now I'll get back to October 1907. I'd bought a yacht and made all preparations to leave New York for a cruise in southern waters. I am really daffy about fishing, and this was the time when I was going to fish to my heart's content from my own yacht, going wherever I wished, whenever I felt like it. Everything was ready. I had made a killing in stocks, but at the last moment, corn held me back. I must explain that before the money panic which gave me my first million, I had been trading in grain at Chicago. I was short 10 million bushels of wheat and 10 million bushels of corn. I had studied the grain markets for a long time and was as bearish on corn and wheat as I had been on stocks. Well, they both started down, but while wheat kept on declining, the biggest of all the Chicago operators, I'll call him Stratton, took it into his head to run a corner in corn. After I cleaned up in stocks and was ready to go south on my yacht, I found that wheat showed me a handsome profit, but in corn, Stratton had run up the price, and I had quite a loss. I knew there was much more corn in the country than the price indicated. The law of demand and supply worked as always, but the demand came chiefly from Stratton and the supply was not coming at all, because there was an acute congestion in the movement of corn. I remember that I used to pray for a cold spell that would freeze the impassable roads and enable the farmers to bring their corn into the market. But no such luck. There I was, waiting to go on my joyously planned fishing trip, and that loss in corn holding me back. I couldn't go away with the market as it was. Of course, Stratton kept pretty close tabs on the short interest. He knew he had me, and I knew it quite as well as he did. But as I said, I was hoping I might convince the weather that it ought to get busy and help me. Perceiving that neither the weather nor any other kindly wonder worker was paying any attention to my needs, I studied how I might work out of my difficulty by my own efforts. I closed out my line of wheat at a good profit. But the problem in corn was infinitely more difficult. If I could have covered my 10 million bushels at the prevailing prices, I instantly and gladly would have done so, large though the loss would have been. But of course, the moment I started to buy in my corn, Stratton would be on the job as squeezer-in-chief, and I no more relished running up the price on myself by reason of my own purchases than cutting my own throat with my own knife. Strong though corn was, my desire to go fishing was even stronger, so it was up to me to find a way out at once. I must conduct a strategic retreat. I must buy back the 10 million bushels I was short of, and in so doing keep down my loss as much as I possibly could. It so happened that Stratton at that time was also running a deal in oats, and had the market pretty well sewed up. I had kept track of all the grain markets in the way of crop news and pit gossip, and I heard that the powerful armor interests were not friendly, market-wise, to Stratton. Of course, I knew that Stratton would not let me have the corn I needed except at his own price, but the moment I heard the rumors about armor being against Stratton, it occurred to me that I might look to the Chicago traders for aid. The only way in which they could possibly help me was for them to sell me the corn that Stratton wouldn't. The rest was easy. First, I put in orders to buy 500,000 bushels of corn, every eighth of a cent down. After these orders were in, I gave to each of 4 houses an order to sell simultaneously 50,000 bushels of oats at the market. That, I figured, ought to make a quick break in oats. Knowing how the traders' minds worked, it was a cinch that they would instantly think that armor was gunning for Stratton. Seeing the attack opened in oats, they would logically conclude that the next break would be in corn, and they would start to sell it. If that corner in corn was busted, the pickings would be fabulous. My dope on the psychology of the Chicago traders was absolutely correct. When they saw oats breaking on the scattered selling, they promptly jumped on corn and sold it with great enthusiasm. I was able to buy 6 million bushels of corn in the next 10 minutes. The moment I found that their selling of corn ceased, I simply bought in the other 4 million bushels at the market. Of course, that made the price go up again, but the net result of my maneuver was that I covered the entire line of 10 million bushels within 1/2 cent of the price prevailing, at the time I started to cover on the traders' selling. The 200,000 bushels of oats that I sold short to start the traders' selling of corn, I covered at a loss of only $3,000. That was pretty cheap bear bait. The profits I had made in wheat offset so much of my deficit in corn that my total loss on all my grain trades that time was only $25,000. Afterwards, corn went up 25 cents a bushel. Stratton undoubtedly had me at his mercy. If I had set about buying my 10 million bushels of corn without bothering to think of the price, there is no telling what I would have had to pay. A man can't spend years at one thing and not acquire a habitual attitude towards it, quite unlike that of the average beginner. The difference distinguishes the professional from the amateur. It is the way a man looks at things that makes or loses money for him in the speculative markets. The public has the dilettante's point of view toward his own effort. The ego obtrudes itself unduly, and the thinking, therefore, is not deep or exhaustive. The professional concerns himself with doing the right thing rather than with making money, knowing that the profit takes care of itself if the other things are attended to. A trader gets to play the game as the professional billiard player does. That is, he looks far ahead instead of considering the particular shot before him. It gets to be an instinct to play for position. I remember hearing a story about Addison Kamek that illustrates very nicely what I wish to point out. From all I have heard, I am inclined to think that Kamek was one of the ablest stock traders the street ever saw. He was not a chronic bear as many believe, but he felt the greater appeal of trading on the bear side, of utilizing in his behalf the two great human factors of hope and fear. He is credited with coining the warning, "Don't sell stocks when the sap is running up the trees." And the old-timers tell me that his biggest winnings were made on the bull side, so that it is plain he did not play prejudices but conditions. At all events, he was a consummate trader. It seems that once, this was way back at the tag end of a bull market, Kamek was bearish, and J. Arthur Joseph, the financial writer and raconteur, knew it. The market, however, was not only strong but still rising in response to prodding by the bull leaders and optimistic reports by the newspapers. Knowing what use a trader like Kamek could make of bearish information, Joseph rushed to Kamek's office one day with glad tidings. "Mr. Kamek, I have a very good friend who was a transfer clerk in the St. Paul office, and he has just told me something which I think you ought to know." "What is it?" asked Kamek listlessly. "You've turned, haven't you?" "You are bearish now?" asked Joseph to make sure. If Kamek wasn't interested, he wasn't going to waste precious ammunition. "Yes. What's the wonderful information?" "I went around to the St. Paul office today, as I do in my news-gathering rounds 2 or 3 times a week, and my friend there said to me, 'The old man is selling stock.' He meant William Rockefeller." "Is he really, Jimmy?" I said to him. And he answered, "Yes. He is selling 1,500 shares every 3/8 of a point up. I've been transferring the stock for 2 or 3 days now. I didn't lose any time, but came right over to tell you." Kamek was not easily excited and, moreover, was so accustomed to having all manner of people rush madly into his office with all manner of news, gossip, rumors, tips, and lies that he had grown distrustful of them all. He merely said now, "Are you sure you heard right, Joseph?" "Am I sure?" "Certainly I am sure." "Do you think I am deaf?" said Joseph. "Are you sure of your man?" "Absolutely," declared Joseph. "I've known him for years. He has never lied to me. He wouldn't. No object. I know he is absolutely reliable, and I'd stake my life on what he tells me. I know him as well as I know anybody in this world, a great deal better than you seem to know me, after all these years." "Sure of him, eh?" And Kamek again looked at Joseph. Then he said, "Well, you ought to know." He called his broker, W.B. Wheeler. Joseph expected to hear him give an order to sell at least 50,000 shares of St. Paul. William Rockefeller was disposing of his holdings in St. Paul, taking advantage of the strength of the market. Whether it was investment stock or speculative holdings was irrelevant. The one important fact was that the best stock trader of the Standard Oil crowd was getting out of St. Paul. What would the average man have done if he had received the news from a trustworthy source? No need to ask. But Kamek, the ablest bear operator of his day, who was bearish on the market just then, said to his broker, "Billy, go over to the board and buy 1,500 St. Paul every 3/8 up." The stock was then in the 90s. "Don't you mean sell?" interjected Joseph hastily. He was no novice in Wall Street, but he was thinking of the market from the point of view of the newspaper man and, incidentally, of the general public. The price certainly ought to go down on the news of inside selling, and there was no better inside selling than Mr. William Rockefeller's. The Standard Oil getting out and Kamek buying. It couldn't be. "No," said Kamek, "I mean buy." "Don't you believe me?" "Yes." "Don't you believe my information?" "Yes." "Aren't you bearish?" "Yes." "Well then, that's why I'm buying. Listen to me now. You keep in touch with that reliable friend of yours, and the moment the scaled selling stops, let me know. Instantly. Do you understand?" "Yes," said Joseph, and went away, not quite sure he could fathom Kamek's motives in buying William Rockefeller's stock. It was the knowledge that Kamek was bearish on the entire market that made his maneuver so difficult to explain. However, Joseph saw his friend the transfer clerk and told him he wanted to be tipped off when the old man got through selling. Regularly twice a day, Joseph called on his friend to inquire. One day the transfer clerk told him, "There isn't any more stock coming from the old man." Joseph thanked him and ran to Kamek's office with the information. Kamek listened attentively, turned to Wheeler and asked, "Billy, how much St. Paul have we got in the office?" Wheeler looked it up and reported that they had accumulated about 60,000 shares. Kamek, being bearish, had been putting out short lines in the other Grangers as well as in various other stocks, even before he began to buy St. Paul. He was now heavily short of the market. He promptly ordered Wheeler to sell the 60,000 shares of St. Paul that they were long of, and more beside. He used his long holdings of St. Paul as a lever to depress the general list and greatly benefit his operations for a decline. St. Paul didn't stop on that move until it reached 44, and Kamek made a killing in it. He played his cards with consummate skill and profited accordingly. The point I would make is his habitual attitude toward trading. He didn't have to reflect. He saw instantly what was far more important to him than his profit on that one stock. He saw that he had providentially been offered an opportunity to begin his big bear operations not only at the proper time, but with a proper initial push. The St. Paul tit made him buy instead of sell, because he saw at once that it gave him a vast supply of the best ammunition for his bear campaign. To get back to myself. After I closed my trade in wheat and corn, I went south in my yacht. I cruised about in Florida waters having a grand old time. The fishing was great. Everything was lovely. I didn't have a care in the world, and I wasn't looking for any. One day I went ashore at Palm Beach. I met a lot of Wall Street friends and others. They were all talking about the most picturesque cotton speculator of the day. A report from New York had it that Percy Thomas had lost every cent. It wasn't a commercial bankruptcy, merely the rumor of the world-famous operator's second Waterloo in the cotton market. I had always felt a great admiration for him. The first I ever heard of him was through the newspapers at the time of the failure of the stock exchange house of Sheldon and Thomas, when Thomas tried to corner cotton. Sheldon, who did not have the vision or the courage of his partner, got cold feet on the very verge of success. At least, so the street said at the time. At all events, instead of making a killing, they made one of the most sensational failures in years. I forget how many millions. The firm was wound up, and Thomas went to work alone. He devoted himself exclusively to cotton, and it was not long before he was on his feet again. He paid off his creditors in full with interest. Debts he was not legally obliged to discharge, and withal had $1 million left to himself. His comeback in the cotton market was in its way as remarkable as Deacon S.V. White's famous stock market exploit of paying off $1 million in 1 year. Thomas's pluck and brains made me admire him immensely. Everybody in Palm Beach was talking about the collapse of Thomas's deal in March cotton. You know how the talk goes, and grows. The amount of misinformation and exaggeration and improvements that you hear. Why, I've seen a rumor about myself grow so that the fellow who started it did not recognize it when it came back to him in less than 24 hours, swollen with new and picturesque details. The news of Percy Thomas's latest misadventure turned my mind from the fishing to the cotton market. I got files of the trade papers and read them to get a line on conditions. When I got back to New York, I gave myself up to studying the market. Everybody was bearish, and everybody was selling July cotton. You know how people are. I suppose it is the contagion of example that makes a man do something because everybody around him is doing the same thing. Perhaps it is some phase or variety in the herd instinct. In any case, it was, in the opinion of hundreds of traders, the wise and proper thing to sell July cotton. And so safe, too. You couldn't call that general selling reckless. The word is too conservative. The traders simply saw one side to the market and a great big profit. They certainly expected a collapse in prices. I saw all this, of course, and it struck me that the chaps who were short didn't have a terrible lot of time to cover in. The more I studied the situation, the clearer I saw this, until I finally decided to buy July cotton. I went to work and quickly bought 100,000 bales. I experienced no trouble in getting it because it came from so many sellers. It seemed to me that I could have offered a reward of $1 million for the capture, dead or alive, of a single trader who was not selling July cotton, and nobody would have claimed it. I should say, this was in the latter part of May. I kept buying more, and they kept on selling it to me until I had picked up all the floating contracts, and I had 120,000 bales. A couple of days after I had bought the last of it, it began to go up. Once it started, the market was kind enough to keep on doing very well indeed. That is, it went up from 40 to 50 points a day. One Saturday, this was about 10 days after I began operations, the price began to creep up. I did not know whether there was any more July cotton for sale. It was up to me to find out, so I waited until the last 10 minutes. At that time, I knew it was usual for those fellows to be short, and if the market closed up for the day, they would be safely hooked. So I sent in 4 different orders to buy 5,000 bales each, at the market, at the same time. That ran the price up 30 points, and the shorts were doing their best to wriggle away. The market closed at the top. All I did remember was to buy that last 20,000 bales. The next day was Sunday, but on Monday, Liverpool was due to open up 20 points to be on a parity with the advance in New York. Instead, it came 50 points higher. That meant that Liverpool had exceeded our advance by 100%. I had nothing to do with the rise in that market. This showed me that my deductions had been sound and that I was trading along the line of least resistance. At the same time, I was not losing sight of the fact that I had a whopping big line to dispose of. A market may advance sharply or rise gradually and yet not possess the power to absorb more than a certain amount of selling. Of course, the Liverpool cables made our own market wild, but I noticed the higher it went, the scarcer July cotton seemed to be. I wasn't letting go any of mine. Altogether, that Monday was an exciting and not very cheerful day for the bears, but for all that, I could detect no signs of impending bear panic. No beginnings of a blind stampede to cover. And I had 140,000 bales for which I must find a market. On Tuesday morning, as I was walking to my office, I met a friend at the entrance of the building. "That was quite a story in the World this morning," he said with a smile. "What story?" I asked. "What? You mean to tell me you haven't seen it?" "I never see the World," I said. "What is the story?" "Why, it's all about you. It says you got July cotton cornered." "I haven't seen it," I told him, and left him. I don't know whether he believed me or not. He probably thought it was highly inconsiderate of me not to tell him whether it was true or not. When I got to the office, I sent out for a copy of the paper. Sure enough, there it was, on the front page, in big headlines. July cotton, cornered by Larry Livingston. Of course, I knew at once that the article would play the dickens with the market. If I had deliberately studied ways and means of disposing of my 140,000 bales to the best advantage, I couldn't have hit upon a better plan. It would not have been possible to find one. That article at that very moment was being read all over the country, either in the World or in other papers quoting it. It had been cabled to Europe. That was plain from the Liverpool prices. That market was simply wild. No wonder with such news. Of course, I knew what New York would do, and what I ought to do. The market here opened at 10 o'clock. At 10 minutes after 10, I did not own any cotton. I let them have every one of my 140,000 bales. For most of my line, I received what proved to be the top prices of the day. The traders made the market for me. All I really did was to see a heaven-sent opportunity to get rid of my cotton. I grasped it because I couldn't help it. What else could I do? The problem that I knew would take a great deal of hard thinking to solve was thus solved for me by an accident. If the World had not published that article, I never would have been able to dispose of my line without sacrificing the greater portion of my paper profits. Selling 140,000 bales of cotton without sending the price down was a trick beyond my powers. But the World story turned it for me very nicely. Why the World published it, I cannot tell you. I never knew. I suppose the writer was tipped off by some friend in the cotton market, and he thought he was printing a scoop. I didn't see him or anybody from the world. I didn't know it was printed that morning until after 9 o'clock. And if it had not been for my friend calling my attention to it, I would not have known it then. Without it, I wouldn't have had a market big enough to unload in. That is one trouble about trading on a large scale. You cannot sneak out as you can when you pike along. You cannot always sell out when you wish, or when you think it wise. You have to get out when you can, when you have a market that will absorb your entire line. Failure to grasp the opportunity to get out may cost you millions. You cannot hesitate. If you do, you are lost. Neither can you try stunts like running up the price on the bears by means of competitive buying, for you may thereby reduce the absorbing capacity. And I want to tell you that perceiving your opportunity is not as easy as it sounds. A man must be on the lookout so alertly that when his chance sticks in its head at his door, he must grab it. Of course not. Everybody knew about my fortunate accident. In Wall Street, and, for that matter, everywhere else, any accident that makes big money for a man is regarded with suspicion. When the accident is unprofitable, it is never considered an accident but the logical outcome of your hoggishness, or of the swelled head. But when there is a profit, they call it loot and talk about how well unscrupulousness fares, and how ill conservatism and decency. It was not only the evil-minded shorts, smarting under punishment brought about by their own recklessness, who accused me of having deliberately planned the coup. Other people thought the same thing. One of the biggest men in cotton in the entire world met me a day or two later and said, "That was certainly the slickest deal you ever put over, Livingston. I was wondering how much you were going to lose when you came to market that line of yours. You knew this market was not big enough to take more than 50 or 60,000 bales without selling off, and how you were going to work off the rest and not lose all your paper profits was beginning to interest me. I didn't think of your scheme. It certainly was slick." I had nothing to do with it, I assured him as earnestly as I could, but all he did was to repeat, "Mighty slick, my boy, mighty slick. Don't be so modest." It was after that deal that some of the papers referred to me as the Cotton King. But as I said, I really was not entitled to that crown. It is not necessary to tell you that there is not enough money in the United States to buy the columns of the New York World, or enough personal pull to secure the publication of a story like that. It gave me an utterly unearned reputation that time. But I have not told this story to moralize on the crowns that are sometimes pressed down upon the brows of undeserving traders, or to emphasize the need of seizing the opportunity, no matter where or how it comes. My object merely was to account for the vast amount of newspaper notoriety that came to me as a result of my deal in July cotton. If it hadn't been for the newspapers, I never would have met that remarkable man, Percy Thomas. Chapter 12. Not long after I closed my July cotton deal more successfully than I had expected, I received by mail a request for an interview. The letter was signed by Percy Thomas. Of course, I immediately answered that I'd be glad to see him at my office at any time he cared to call. The next day he came. I had long admired him. His name was a household word wherever men took an interest in growing or buying or selling cotton. In Europe as well as all over this country, people quoted Percy Thomas's opinions to me. I remember once at a Swiss resort talking to a Cairo banker who was interested in cotton growing in Egypt in association with the late Sir Ernest Cassell. When he heard I was from New York, he immediately asked me about Percy Thomas, whose market reports he received and read with unfailing regularity. Thomas, I always thought, went about his business scientifically. He was a true speculator, a thinker with the vision of a dreamer and the courage of a fighting man, an unusually well-informed man who knew both the theory and the practice of trading in cotton. He loved to hear and to express ideas and theories and abstractions, and at the same time, there was mighty little about the practical side of the cotton market or the psychology of cotton traders that he did not know, for he had been trading for years and had made and lost vast sums. After the failure of his old stock exchange firm of Sheldon and Thomas, he went it alone. Inside of 2 years, he came back, almost spectacularly. I remember reading in the Sun that the first thing he did when he got back on his feet financially was to pay off his old creditors in full, and the next was to hire an expert to study and determine for him how he had best invest $1 million. This expert examined the properties and analyzed the reports of several companies and then recommended the purchase of Delaware and Hudson stock. Well, after having failed for millions and having come back with more millions, Thomas was cleaned out as the result of his deal in March cotton. There wasn't much time wasted after he came to see me. He proposed that we form a working alliance. Whatever information he got, he would immediately turn over to me before passing it on to the public. My part would be to do the actual trading, for which he said I had a special genius, and he hadn't. That did not appeal to me for a number of reasons. I told him frankly that I did not think I could run in double harness and wasn't keen about trying to learn. But he insisted that it would be an ideal combination until I said flatly that I did not want to have anything to do with influencing other people to trade. If I fool myself, I told him, I alone suffer and I pay the bill at once. There are no drawn-out payments or unexpected annoyances. I play a lone hand by choice, and also because it is the wisest and cheapest way to trade. I get my pleasure out of matching my brains against the brains of other traders, men whom I have never seen and never talked to, and never advised to buy or sell, and never expect to meet or know. When I make money, I make it backing my own opinions. I don't sell them or capitalize them. If I made money in any other way, I would imagine I had not earned it. Your proposition does not interest me, because I am interested in the game only as I play it for myself and in my own way. He said he was sorry I felt the way I did, and tried to convince me that I was wrong in rejecting his plan. But I stuck to my views. The rest was a pleasant talk. I told him I knew he would come back, and that I would consider it a privilege if he would allow me to be of financial assistance to him. But he said he could not accept any loans from me. Then he asked me about my July deal, and I told him all about it, how I had gone into it and how much cotton I bought and the price and other details. We chatted a little more, and then he went away. When I said to you some time ago that a speculator has a host of enemies, many of whom successfully bore from within, I had in mind my many mistakes. I have learned that a man may possess an original mind and a lifelong habit of independent thinking, and withal be vulnerable to attacks by a persuasive personality. I am fairly immune from the commoner speculative ailments, such as greed and fear and hope. But being an ordinary man, I find I can err with great ease. I ought to have been on my guard at this particular time, because not long before that I had had an experience that proved how easily a man may be talked into doing something against his judgment and even against his wishes. It happened in Harding's office. I had a sort of private office, a room that they let me occupy by myself, and nobody was supposed to get to me during market hours without my consent. I didn't wish to be bothered, and as I was trading on a very large scale and my account was fairly profitable, I was pretty well guarded. One day, just after the market closed, I heard somebody say, "Good afternoon, Mr. Livingston." I turned and saw an utter stranger, a chap of about 35. I could not understand how he'd got in, but there he was. I concluded his business with me had passed him. But I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, and pretty soon he said, "I came to see you about that Walter Scott." And he was off. He was a book agent. Now, he was not particularly pleasing a man or skillful of speech. Neither was he especially attractive to look at. But he certainly had personality. He talked, and I thought I listened. But I do not know what he said. I don't think I ever knew. Not even at the time. When he finished his monologue, he handed me first his fountain pen, and then a blank form, which I signed. It was a contract to take a set of Scott's works for $500. The moment I signed, I came to. But he had the contract safe in his pocket. I did not want the books. I had no place for them. They weren't of any use whatever to me. I had nobody to give them to. Yet I had agreed to buy them for $500. I am so accustomed to losing money that I never think first of that phase of my mistakes. It is always the play itself, the reason why. In the first place, I wish to know my own limitations and habits of thought. Another reason is that I do not wish to make the same mistake a second time. A man can excuse his mistakes only by capitalizing them to his subsequent profit. Well, having made a $500 mistake, but not yet having localized the trouble, I just looked at the fellow to size him up as a first step. I'll be hanged if he didn't actually smile at me. An understanding little smile. He seemed to read my thoughts. I somehow knew that I did not have to explain anything to him. He knew it without my telling him. So I skipped the explanations and the preliminaries and asked him, "How much commission will you get on that $500 order?" He promptly shook his head and said, "I can't do it. Sorry." "How much do you get?" I persisted. "A third. But I can't do it," he said. "A third of $500 is $166.66. I'll give you $200 cash if you give me back that signed contract." And to prove it, I took the money out of my pocket. "I told you I couldn't do it," he said. "Do all of you customers make the same offer to you?" I asked. "No," he answered. "Then why were you so sure that I was going to make it? It is what your type of sport would do. You are a first-class loser, and that makes you a first-class businessman. I am much obliged to you, but I can't do it. Now tell me why you do not wish to make more than your commission?" "It isn't that exactly," he said. "I am not working just for the commission." "What are you working for then?" "For the commission in the record," he answered. What record?" "Mine." "What are you driving at?" "Do you work for money alone?" he asked me. "Yes," I said. "No." And he shook his head. "No, you don't. You wouldn't get enough fun out of it. You certainly do not work merely to add a few more dollars to your bank account. And you are not in Wall Street because you like easy money. You get your fun some other way." "Well, same here." I did not argue, but asked him, "And how do you get your fun?" "Well," he confessed, "we've all got a weak spot." "And what's yours?" "Vanity," he said. "Well," I told him, "you've succeeded in getting me to sign on. Now I want to sign off, and I am paying you $200 for 10 minutes work. Isn't that enough for your pride?" "No," he answered. "You see, all the rest of the bunch have been working Wall Street for months and failed to make expenses. They said it was the fault of the goods in the territory. So the office sent for me to prove that the fault was with their salesmanship and not with the books or the place. They were working on a 25% commission. I was in Cleveland where I sold 82 sets in 2 weeks. I am here to sell a certain number of sets, not only to people who did not buy from the other agents, but to people they couldn't even get to see. That's why they give me 33 1/3%. I can't quite figure out how you sold me that set." "Why," he said consolingly, "I sold J.P. Morgan a set." "No, you didn't," I said. He wasn't angry. He simply said, "Honest, I did. A set of Walter Scott to J.P. Morgan, who not only has some fine editions, but probably the original manuscripts of some of the novels as well. Well, here's his John Hancock." And he promptly flashed on me a contract signed by J.P. Morgan himself. It might not have been Mr. Morgan's signature, but it did not occur to me to doubt it at the time. Didn't he have mine in his pocket? All I felt was curiosity. So I asked him, "How did you get past the librarian?" "I didn't see any librarian. I saw the old man himself, in the office." "That's too much," I said. Everybody knew that it was much harder to get into Mr. Morgan's private office empty-handed than into the White House with a parcel that ticked like an alarm clock. But he declared, "I did." "But how did you get into his office?" "How did I get into yours?" he retorted. "I don't know. You tell me," I said. "Well, the way I got into Morgan's office and the way I got into yours are the same. I just talked to the fellow at the door, whose business it was not to let me in. And the way I got Morgan to sign was the same way I got you to sign. You weren't signing a contract for a set of books. You just took the fountain pen I gave you and did what I asked you to do with it. No difference. Same as you." "And is that really Morgan's signature?" I asked him, about 3 minutes late with my skepticism. "Sure. He learned how to write his name when he was a boy." "And that's all there is to it?" "That's all," he answered. "I know exactly what I am doing. That's all the secret there is. I am much obliged to you. Good day, Mr. Livingston." And he started to go out. "Hold on," I said. "I'm bound to have you making even $200 out of me." And I handed him $35. He shook his head. Then, "No," he said. "I can't do that, but I can do this." And he took the contract from his pocket, tore it in two, and gave me the pieces. I counted $200 and held the money before him. But he again shook his head. "Isn't that what you meant?" I said. "No," Then, why did you tear up the contract? Because you did not whine, but took it as I would have taken it myself had I been in your place. But I offered you the $200 of my own accord, I said. I know, but money isn't everything. Something in his voice made me say, you're right, it isn't. And now, what do you really want me to do for you? You're quick, aren't you? He said. Do you really want to do something for me? Yes, I told him. I do. But whether I will or not, depends what it is you have in mind. Take me with you into Mr. Ed Harding's office and tell him to let me talk to him 3 minutes by the clock. Then leave me alone with him. I shook my head and said, he is a good friend of mine. He's 50 years old and a stockbroker, said the book agent. That was perfectly true, so I took him into Ed's office. I did not hear anything more from or about that book agent. But one evening, some weeks later, when I was going uptown, I ran across him in a 6th Avenue L train. He raised his hat very politely, and I nodded back. He came over and asked me, how do you do, Mr. Livingston? And how is Mr. Harding? He's well. Why do you ask? I felt he was holding back the story. I sold him $2,000 worth of books that day you took me in to see him. He never said a word to me about it, I said. No, that kind doesn't talk about it. What kind doesn't talk? The kind that never makes mistakes on account of his being bad business to make them. That kind always knows what he wants and nobody can tell him different. That is the kind that's educating my children and keeps my wife in good humor. You did me a good turn, Mr. Livingston. I expected it when I gave up the $200 you were so anxious to present to me. And if Mr. Harding hadn't given you an order? Oh, but I knew he would. I had found out what kind of man he was. He was a cinch. Yes, but if he hadn't bought any books, I persisted, I'd have come back to you and sold you something. Good day, Mr. Livingston. I'm going to see the mayor. And he got up as we pulled up at Park Place. I hope you sell him 10 sets, I said. His Honor was a Tammany man. I'm a Republican too, he said and went out. Not hastily, but leisurely, confident that the train would wait. And it did. I have told you this story in such detail because it concerned a remarkable man who made me buy what I did not wish to buy. He was the first man who did that to me. There never should have been a second, but there was. You can never bank on there being but one remarkable salesman in the world, or on complete immunization from the influence of personality. When Percy Thomas left my office, after I had pleasantly but definitely declined to enter into a working alliance with him, I would have sworn that our business paths would never cross. I was not sure I'd ever see him again. But on the very next day, he wrote me a letter, thanking me for my offers of help and inviting me to come and see him. I answered that I would. He wrote again. I called. I got to see a great deal of him. It was always a pleasure for me to listen to him. He knew so much, and he expressed his knowledge so interestingly. I think he is the most magnetic man I ever met. We talked of many things, for he is a widely read man with an amazing grasp of many subjects and a remarkable gift for interesting generalization. The wisdom of his speech is impressive, and as for plausibility, he hasn't an equal. I have heard many people accuse Percy Thomas of many things, including insincerity, but I sometimes wonder if his remarkable plausibility does not come from the fact that he first convinces himself so thoroughly as to acquire thereby a greatly increased power to convince others. Of course, we talked about market matters at great length. I was not bullish on cotton, but he was. I could not see the bull side at all, but he did. He brought up so many facts and figures that I ought to have been overwhelmed, but I wasn't. I couldn't disprove them because I could not deny their authenticity, but they did not shake my belief in what I read for myself. But he kept at it until I no longer felt sure of my own information as gathered from the trade papers and the dailies. That meant I couldn't set the market with my own eyes. A man cannot be convinced against his own convictions, but he can be talked into a state of uncertainty and indecision, which is even worse. But that means that he cannot trade with confidence and comfort. I cannot say that I got all mixed up exactly, but I lost my poise, or rather, I ceased to do my own thinking. I cannot give you in detail the various steps by which I reached a state of mind that was to prove so costly to me, I think it was his assurances of the accuracy of his figures, which were exclusively his, and the undependability of mine, which were not exclusively mine, but public property. He harped on the utter reliability, as proved time and again, of all his 10,000 correspondents throughout the South. In the end, I came to read conditions as he himself read them, because we were both reading from the same page of the same book, held by him before my eyes. He has a logical mind. Once I accepted his facts, it was a cinch that my own conclusions, derived from his facts, would agree with his own. When he began his talks with me about the cotton situation, I not only was bearish, but I was short of the market. Gradually, as I began to accept his facts and figures, I began to fear I had been basing my previous position on misinformation. Of course, I could not feel that way and not cover. And once I had covered because Thomas made me think I was wrong, I simply had to go long. It is the way my mind works. You know, I have done nothing in my life but trade in stocks and commodities. I naturally think that if it is wrong to be bearish, it must be right to be a bull. And if it is right to be a bull, it is imperative to buy. As my old Palm Beach friend said, Pat Hearn used to say, "You can't tell till you bet." I must prove whether I am right on the market or not, and the proofs are to be read only in my broker's statements at the end of the month. I started in to buy cotton, and in a jiffy, I had my usual line, about 60,000 bales. It was the most asinine play of my career. Instead of standing or falling by my own observation and deductions, I was merely playing another man's game. It was eminently fitting that my silly plays should not end with that. I not only bought when I had no business to be bullish, but I didn't accumulate my line in accordance with the promptings of experience. I wasn't trading right. Having listened, I was lost. The market was not going my way. I am never afraid or impatient when I am sure of my position. But the market didn't act the way it should have acted, had Thomas been right. Having taken the first wrong step, I took the second and the third, and of course it muddled me all up. I allowed myself to be persuaded not only into not taking my loss, but into holding up the market. That is a style of play foreign to my nature and contrary to my trading principles and theories. Even as a boy in the bucket shops, I had known better. But I was not myself. I was another man, a Thomas-sized person. I not only was long of cotton, but I was carrying a heavy line of wheat. That was doing famously and showed me a handsome profit. My fool efforts to bolster up cotton had increased my line to about 150,000 bales. I may tell you that about this time, I was not feeling very well. I don't say this to furnish an excuse for my blunders, but merely to state a pertinent fact. I remember I went to Bayshore for a rest. While there, I did some thinking. It seemed to me that my speculative commitments were overlarge. I am not timid as a rule, but I got to feeling nervous, and that made me decide to lighten my load. To do this, I must clean up either the cotton or the wheat. It seems incredible that knowing the game as well as I did, and with an experience of 12 or 14 years of speculating in stocks and commodities, I did precisely the wrong thing. The cotton showed me a loss and I kept it. The wheat showed me a profit and I sold it out. It was an utterly foolish play, but all I can say in extenuation is that it wasn't really my deal, but Thomas's. Of all speculative blunders, there are few greater than trying to average a losing gain. My cotton deal proved it to the hilt a little later. Always sell what shows you a loss, and keep what shows you a profit. That was so obviously the wise thing to do, and was so well known to me that even now, I marvel at myself for doing the reverse. And so, I sold my wheat, deliberately cut short my profit in it. After I got out of it, the price went up 20 cents a bushel without stopping. If I had kept it, I might have taken a profit of about $8 million. And having decided to keep on with the losing proposition, I bought more cotton. I remember very clearly how every day I would buy cotton, more cotton. And why do you think I bought it? To keep the price from going down. If that isn't a super sucker play, what is? I simply kept putting up more and more money to lose eventually. My brokers and my intimate friends couldn't understand it, And they don't to this day. Of course, if the deal had turned out differently, I would have been a wonder. More than once, I was warned against placing too much reliance on Percy Thomas's brilliant analyses. To this I paid no heed, but kept on buying cotton to keep it from going down. I was even buying it in Liverpool. I accumulated 440,000 bales before I realized what I was doing, and then it was too late. So I sold out my line. I lost nearly all that I had made out of all my other deals in stocks and commodities. I was not completely cleaned out, but I had left fewer hundreds of thousands than I had millions before I met my brilliant friend Percy Thomas. For me, of all men, to violate all the laws that experience had taught me to observe in order to prosper was more than asinine. To learn that a man can make foolish plays for no reason whatever was a valuable lesson. It cost me millions to learn that another dangerous enemy to a trader is his susceptibility to the urgings of a magnetic personality when plausibly expressed by a brilliant mind. It has always seemed to me, however, that I might have learned my lesson quite as well if the cost had been only 1 million. But fate does not always let you fix the tuition fee. She delivers the educational wallop and presents her own bill, knowing you have to pay it, no matter what the amount may be. Having learned what folly I was capable of, I closed that particular incident. Percy Thomas went out of my life. There I was, with more than 9/10 of my state, as Jim Fisk used to say, gone where the woodbine twineth. Up the spout. I had been a millionaire rather less than a year. My millions I had made by using brains, helped by luck. I had lost them by reversing the process. I sold my 2 yachts, and was decidedly less extravagant in my manner of living. But that one blow wasn't enough. Luck was against me. I ran up first, against illness, and then against the urgent need of $200,000 in cash. A few months before, that sum would have been nothing at all, but now it meant almost the entire remnant of my fleet-winged fortune. I had to supply the money, and the question was, where would I get it? I didn't want to take it out of the balance I kept at my brokers, because if I did, I wouldn't have much of a margin left for my own trading. And I needed trading facilities more than ever if I was to win back my millions quickly. There was only one alternative that I could see, and that was to take it out of the stock market. Just think of it. If you know much about the average customer of the average commission house, you will agree with me that the hope of making the stock market pay your bill is one of the most prolific sources of loss in Wall Street. You will chip out all you have if you adhere to your determination. Why, in Harding's office, one winter, a little bunch of high flyers spent $30,000 or $40,000 for an overcoat, and not one of them lived to wear it. It so happened that a prominent floor trader, who since has become world famous as one of the dollar-a-year men, came down to the exchange wearing a fur overcoat lined with sea otter. In those days, before furs went up sky high, that coat was valued at only $10,000. Well, one of the chaps in Harding's office, Bob Keown, decided to get a coat lined with Russian sable. He priced one uptown. The cost was about the same, $10,000. That's the devil of a lot of money, objected one of the fellers. Oh, fair, admitted Bob Keown amiably. About a week's wages, unless you guys promise to present it to me as a slight but sincere token of the esteem way in which you hold the nicest man in the office. Do I hear the presentation speech? No? Very well. I shall let the stock market buy it for me. Why do you want a sable coat? Asked Ed Harding. It would look particularly well on a man of my inches, replied Bob, drawing himself up. And how did you say you were going to pay for it? Asked Jim Murphy, who was the star tip chaser of the office. By a judicious investment of a temporary character, James. That's how, answered Bob, who knew that Murphy merely wanted a tip. Sure enough, Jimmy asked, what stock are you going to buy? Wrong as usual, friend. This is no time to buy anything. I propose to sell 5,000 steel. It ought to go down 10 points at the least. I'll just take 2.5 points net. That is conservative, isn't it? What do you hear about it? Asked Murphy eagerly. He was a tall, thin man with black hair and a hungry look, due to his never going out to lunch for fear of missing something on the tape. I hear that coat's the most becoming I ever planned to get. He turned to Harding and said, "Ed, sell 5,000 US steel, common at the market. Today, darling." He was a plunger, Bob was, and liked to indulge in humorous talk. It was his way of letting the world know that he had an iron nerve. He sold 5,000 steel, and the stock promptly went up. Not being half as big an ass as he seemed when he talked, Bob stopped his loss at 1.5 points and confided to the office that the New York climate was too benign for fur coats. They were unhealthy and ostentatious. The rest of the fellows jeered. But it was not long before one of them bought some Union Pacific to pay for the coat. He lost $1,800 and said sables were all right for the outside of a woman's wrap, but not for the inside of a garment intended to be worn by a modest and intelligent man. After that, one after another of the fellows tried to coax the market to pay for that coat. One day I said I would buy it to keep the office from going broke, but they all said that it wasn't a sporting thing to do, that if I wanted the coat for myself, I ought to let the market give it to me. But Ed Harding strongly approved of my intention, and that same afternoon, I went to the furrier's to buy it. I found out that a man from Chicago had bought it the week before. That was only one case. There isn't a man in Wall Street who has not lost money trying to make the market pay for an automobile, or a bracelet, or a motorboat, or a painting. I could build a huge hospital with the birthday presents that the tight-fisted stock market has refused to pay for. In fact, of all hoodoos in Wall Street, I think the resolve to induce the stock market to act as a fairy godmother is the busiest and most persistent. Like all well-authenticated hoodoos, this has its reason for being. What does a man do when he sets out to make the stock market pay for a sudden need? Why, he merely hopes. He gambles. He therefore runs much greater risk than he would if he was speculating intelligently, in accordance with opinions or beliefs logically arrived at after a dispassionate study of underlying conditions. To begin with, he is after an immediate profit. He cannot afford to wait. The market must be nice to him at once, if at all. He flatters himself that he is not asking more than to place an even money bet. Because he is prepared to run quick, say, stop his loss at 2 points when all he hopes to make is 2 points. He hunts the fallacy that he has merely taken a 50-50 chance. Why, I've known men to lose thousands of dollars on such trades, particularly on purchases made at the height of a bull market just before a moderate reaction. It certainly is no way to trade. Well, that crown and folly of my career as a stock operator was the last straw. It beat me. I lost what little my cotton deal had left me. It did even more harm, for I kept on trading and losing. I persisted in thinking that the stock market must perforce make money from me in the end. But the only end in sight was the end of my resources. I went into debt, not only to my principal brokers but to other houses that accepted business from me without my putting up an adequate margin. I not only got in debt, but I stayed in debt from then on. Chapter 13. There I was, once more broke, which was bad, and dead wrong in my trading, which was a sight worse. I was sick, nervous, upset, and unable to reason calmly. That is, I was in the frame of mind in which no speculator should be when he is trading. Everything went wrong with me. Indeed, I began to think that I could not recover my departed sense of proportion. Having grown accustomed to swinging a big line, say, more than 100,000 shares of stock, I feared I would not show good judgment trading in a small way. It scarcely seemed worthwhile being right when all you carried was 100 shares of stock. After the habit of taking a big profit on a big line, I wasn't sure I would know when to take my profit on a small line. I can't describe to you how weaponless I felt. Broke again and incapable of assuming the offensive vigorously. In debt and wrong. After all those long years of successes, tempered by mistakes that really served to pave the way for greater successes, I was now worse off than when I began in the bucket shops. I had learned a great deal about the game of stock speculation, but I had not learned quite so much about the play of human weaknesses. There is no mind so machine-like that you can depend upon it to function with equal efficiency at all times. I now learned that I could not trust myself to remain equally unaffected by men and misfortunes at all times. Money losses have never worried me in the slightest, but other troubles, could and did. I studied my disaster in detail, and of course, found no difficulty in seeing just where I had been silly. I spotted the exact time and place. A man must know himself thoroughly if he is going to make a good job out of trading in the speculative markets. To know what I was capable of in the line of folly was a long educational step. I sometimes think that no price is too high for a speculator to pay to learn that which will keep him from getting the swelled head. A great many smashes by brilliant men can be traced directly to the swelled head, an expensive disease everywhere to everybody, but particularly in Wall Street to a speculator. I was not happy in New York, feeling the way I did. I didn't want to trade because I wasn't in good trading trim. I decided to go away and seek a stake elsewhere. The change of scene could help me to find myself again, I thought. So once more I left New York, beaten by the game of speculation. I was worse than broke, since I owed over $100,000 spread among various brokers. I went to Chicago and there found a stake. It was not a very substantial stake, but that merely meant that I would need a little more time to win back my fortune. A house that I once had done business with had faith in my ability as a trader, and they were willing to prove it by allowing me to trade in their office in a small way. I began very conservatively. I don't know how I might have fared had I stayed there. But one of the most remarkable experiences in my career cut short my stay in Chicago. It is an almost incredible story. One day I got a telegram from Lucius Tucker. I had known him when he was the office manager of a stock exchange firm that I had at times given some business to, but I had lost track of him. The telegram read, "Come to New York at once. L. Tucker." I knew that he knew from mutual friends how I was fixed, and therefore it was certain he had something up his sleeve. At the same time, I had no money to throw away on an unnecessary trip to New York. So instead of doing what he asked me to do, I got him on the long distance. "I got your telegram," I said. "What does it mean?" "It means that a big banker in New York wants to see you," he answered. "Who is it?" I asked. I couldn't imagine who it could be. "I'll tell you when you come to New York. No use otherwise." "You say he wants to see me?" "He does." "What about?" "He'll tell you in person if you give him a chance," said Lucius. "Can't you write me?" "No." "Then tell me more plainly," I said. "I don't want to." "Look here, Lucius," I said, "just tell me this much. Is this a fool trip?" "Certainly not. It will be to your advantage to come." "Can't you give me an inkling?" "No," he said. "It wouldn't be fair to him. And besides, I don't know just how much he wants to do for you. But take my advice. Come, and come quick." "Are you sure it is I that he wishes to see?" "Nobody else but you will do. Better come, I tell you. Telegraph me what train you take and I'll meet you at the station." "Very well," I said and hung up. I didn't like quite so much mystery, but I knew that Lucius was friendly and that he must have a good reason for talking the way he did. I wasn't faring so sumptuously in Chicago that it would break my heart to leave it. At the rate I was trading, it would be a long time before I could get together enough money to operate on the old scale. I came back to New York, not knowing what would happen. Indeed, more than once during the trip I feared nothing at all would happen, and that I'd be out my railroad fare in my time. I could not guess that I was about to have the most curious experience of my entire life. Lucius met me at the station and did not waste any time in telling me that he had sent for me at the urgent request of Mr. Daniel Williamson, of the well-known stock exchange house of Williamson and Brown. Mr. Williamson told Lucius to tell me that he had a business proposition to make to me, that he was sure I would accept, since it would be very profitable for me. Lucius swore he didn't know what the proposition was. The character of the firm was a guarantee that nothing improper would be demanded of me. Dan Williamson was the senior member of the firm, which was founded by Egbert Williamson way back in the 70s. There was no Brown and hadn't been one in the firm for years. The house had been very prominent in Dan's father's time, and Dan had inherited a considerable fortune and didn't go after much outside business. They had one customer who was worth 100 average customers, and that was Alvin Marquardt, Williamson's brother-in-law, who in addition to being a director in a dozen banks and trust companies, was the president of the Great Chesapeake and Atlantic Railroad System. He was the most picturesque personality in the railroad world after James J. Hill, and was the spokesman and dominant member of the powerful banking coterie known as the Fort Dawson Gang. He was worth from $50 million to $500 million, the estimate depending upon the state of the speaker's liver. When he died, they found out that he was worth $250 million, all made in Wall Street. So you see, he was some customer. Lucius told me he had just accepted a position with Williamson and Brown, one that was made for him. He was supposed to be a sort of circulating general business getter. The firm was after a general commission business, and Lucius had induced Mr. Williamson to open a couple of branch offices, one in one of the big hotels uptown and the other in Chicago. I rather gathered that I was going to be offered a position in the latter place, possibly as office manager, which was something I would not accept. I didn't jump on Lucius because I thought I'd better wait until the offer was made before I refused it. Lucius took me into Mr. Williamson's private office, introduced me to his chief, and left the room in a hurry, as though he wished to avoid being called as witness in a case in which he knew both parties. I prepared to listen, and then to say no. Mr. Williamson was very pleasant. He was a thorough gentleman with polished manners and a kindly smile. I could see that he made friends easily and kept them. Why not? He was healthy and therefore good-humored. He had slathers of money and therefore could not be suspected of sordid motives. These things, together with his education and social training, made it easy for him to be not only polite but friendly, and not only friendly but helpful. I said nothing. I had nothing to say, and besides, I always let the other man have his say in full before I do any talking. Somebody told me that the late James Stillman, president of the National City Bank, who, by the way, was an intimate friend of Williamson's, made it his practice to listen in silence, with an impassive face, to anybody who brought a proposition to him. After the man got through, Mr. Stillman continued to look at him, as though the man had not finished. So the man, feeling urged to say something more, did so. Simply by looking and listening, Stillman often made the man offer terms much more advantageous to the bank than he had meant to offer when he began to speak. I don't keep silent just to induce people to offer a better bargain, but because I like to know all the facts of the case. By letting a man have his say in full, you were able to decide at once. It is a great time saver. It averts debates and prolonged discussions that get nowhere. Nearly every business proposition that is brought to me can be settled, as far as my participation in it is concerned, by my saying yes or no. But I cannot say yes or no right off unless I have the complete proposition before me. Dan Williamson did the talking and I did the listening. He told me he had heard a great deal about my operations in the stock market and how he regretted that I had gone outside of my bailiwick and come a cropper in cotton. Still, it was to my bad luck that he owed the pleasure of that interview with me. He thought my forte was the stock market, that I was born for it and that I should not stray from it. And that is the reason, Mr. Livingston, he concluded pleasantly, why we wish to do business with you. Do business how? I asked him. Be a broker's, he said. My firm would like to do your stock business. I'd like to give it to you, I said, but I can't. Why not? He asked. I haven't any money, I answered. That part is all right, he said with a friendly smile. I'll furnish it. He took out a pocket checkbook, wrote out a check for $25,000 to my order, and gave it to me. What's this for? I asked. For you to deposit in your own bank. You withdraw your own checks. I want you to do your trading in our office. I don't care whether you win or lose. If that money goes, I will give you another personal check. So you don't have to be so very careful with this one. See? I knew that the firm was too rich and prosperous to need anybody's business, much less to give a fellow the money to put up his margin. And then he was so nice about it. Instead of giving me a credit with the house, he gave me the actual cash, so that he alone knew where it came from. The only string being that if I traded, I should do so through his firm. And then, the promise that there would be more, if that went. Still, there must be a reason. What's the idea? I asked him. The idea is simply that we want to have a customer in this office who is known as a big, active trader. Everybody knows that you swing a big line on the short side, which is what I particularly like about you. You are known as a plunger. I still don't get it, I said. I'll be frank with you, Mr. Livingston. We have 2 or 3 very wealthy customers who buy and sell stocks in a big way. I don't want the street to suspect them of selling long stock every time we sell 10 or 20,000 shares of any stock. If the street knows that you are trading in our office, it will not know whether it is your short selling or the other customer's long stock that is coming on the market. I understood at once. He wanted to cover up his brother-in-law's operations with my reputation as a plunger. It so happened that I had made my biggest killing on the bear side a year and a half before. And of course, the street gossips and the stupid rumor mongers had acquired the habit of blaming me for every decline in prices. To this day, when the market is very weak, they say I am raiding it. I didn't have to reflect. I saw at a glance that Dan Williamson was offering me a chance to come back and come back quickly. I took the check, banked it, opened an account with his firm, and began trading. It was a good active market, broad enough for a man not to have to stick to 1 or 2 specialties. I had begun to fear, as I told you, that I had lost the knack of hitting it right. But it seems I hadn't. In 3 weeks' time, I had made a profit of $112,000 out of the $25,000 that Dan Williamson lent me. I went to him and said, "I've come to pay you back that $25,000. No, he said, and waved me away exactly as if I had offered him a castor oil cocktail. No, my boy. Wait until your account amounts to something. Don't think about it yet. You've only got chicken feed there?" There is, where I made the mistake that I have regretted more than any other I ever made in my Wall Street career. It was responsible for long and dreary years of suffering. I should have insisted on his taking the money. I was on my way to a bigger fortune than I had lost and walking pretty fast. For 3 weeks, my average profit was 150% per week. From then on, my trading would be on a steadily increasing scale. But instead of freeing myself from all obligation, I let him have his way and did not compel him to accept the $25,000. Of course, since he didn't draw out the $25,000 he had advanced me, I felt I could not very well draw out my profit. I was very grateful to him, but I am so constituted that I don't like to owe money or favors. I can pay the money back with money, but the favors and kindnesses I must pay back in kind. And you were apt to find these moral obligations mighty high-priced at times. Moreover, there is no statute of limitations. I left the money undisturbed and resumed my trading. I was getting on very nicely. I was recovering my poise, and I was sure it would not be very long before I should get back into my 1907 stride. Once I did that, all I'd ask for would be for the market to hold out a little while, and I'd more than make up my losses. But making or not making the money was not bothering me much. What made me happy was that I was losing the habit of being wrong, of not being myself. It had played havoc with me for months, but I had learned my lesson. Just about that time I turned bear and I began to sell short several railroad stocks. Among them was Chesapeake and Atlantic. I think I put out a short line in it, about 8,000 shares. One morning when I got downtown, Dan Williamson called me into his private office before the market opened and said to me, "Larry, don't do anything in Chesapeake and Atlantic just now. That was a bad play of yours, selling 8,000 short. I covered it for you this morning in London and went long. I was short Chesapeake and Atlantic was going down. The tape told it to me quite plainly. And besides, I was bearish on the whole market. Not violently or insanely bearish, but enough to feel comfortable with a moderate short line out." I said to Williamson, "What did you do that for?" "I am bearish on the whole market and they are all going lower." But he just shook his head and said, "I did it because I happen to know something about Chesapeake and Atlantic that you couldn't know. My advice to you was not to sell that stock short until I tell you it is safe to do so." What could I do? That wasn't an asinine tip. It was advice that came from the brother-in-law of the chairman of the board of directors. Dan was not only Alvin Marquand's closest friend, but he had been kind and generous to me. He had shown his faith in me and confidence in my word. I couldn't do less than to thank him. And so my feelings again won over my judgment, and I gave in. To subordinate my judgment to his desires was the undoing of me. Gratitude is something a decent man can't help feeling, but it is, for a fellow to keep it from completely tying him up. The first thing I knew, I not only had lost all my profit, but I owed the firm $150,000 besides. I felt pretty badly about it, but Dan told me not to worry. "I'll get you out of this hole," he promised. "I know I will, but I can only do it if you let me. You will have to stop doing business on your own hook. I can't be working for you and then have you completely undo all my work in your behalf. Just lay off the market and give me a chance to make some money for you. Won't you, Larry?" Again, I ask you, what could I do? I thought of his kindliness, and I could not do anything that might be construed as lacking in appreciation. I had grown to like him. He was very pleasant and friendly. I remember that all I got from him was encouragement. He kept on assuring me that everything would come out okay. One day, perhaps 6 months later, he came to me with a pleased smile and gave me some credit slips. "I told you I would pull you out of that hole," he said. "And I have." And then I discovered that not only had he wiped out the debt entirely, but I had a small credit balance besides. I think I could have run that up without much trouble, for the market was right. But he said to me, "I have bought you 10,000 shares of Southern Atlantic." That was another road controlled by his brother-in-law, Alvin Marquand, who also ruled the market destinies of the stock. When a man does for you what Dan Williamson did for me, you can't say anything but, "Thank you," no matter what your market views may be. You may be sure you're right, but, as Pat Hearn used to say, you can't tell till you bet. And Dan Williamson had bet for me, with his money. Well, Southern Atlantic went down and stayed down, and I lost, I forget how much on my 10,000 shares before Dan sold me out. I owed him more than ever. But you never saw a nicer or less importunate creditor in your life. Never a whimper from him. Instead, encouraging words and admonitions not to worry about it. In the end, the loss was made up for me in the same generous but mysterious way. He gave no details whatever. They were all numbered accounts. Dan Williamson would just say to me, "We made up your Southern Atlantic loss with profits on this other deal." And he'd tell me how he had sold 7,500 shares of some other stock and made a nice thing out of it. I can truthfully say that I never knew a blessed thing about those trades of mine until I was told that the indebtedness was wiped out. After that happened several times, I began to think, and I got to look at my case from a different angle. Finally, I tumbled. It was plain that I had been used by Dan Williamson. It made me angry to think it, but still angrier that I had not tumbled to it quicker. As soon as I had gone over the whole thing in my mind, I went to Dan Williamson, told him I was through with the firm, and I quit the office of Williamson and Brown. I had no words with him, or any of his partners. What good would that have done me? But I will admit that I was sore. At myself, quite as much as at Williamson and Brown. The loss of the money didn't bother me. Whenever I have lost money in the stock market, I have always considered that I have learned something. That if I have lost money, I have gained experience, so that the money really went for a tuition fee. A man has to have experience, and he has to pay for it. But there was something that hurt a whole lot in that experience of mine in Dan Williamson's office, and that was the loss of a great opportunity. The money a man loses is nothing. He can make it up. But opportunities such as I had then do not come every day. The market, you see, had been a fine trading market. I was right. I was reading it accurately. The opportunity to make millions was there. But I allowed my gratitude to interfere with my play. I tied my own hands. I had to do what Dan Williamson in his kindness wished done. Altogether, it was more unsatisfactory than doing business with a relative. Bad business. And that wasn't the worst thing about it. It was that after that, there was practically no opportunity for me to make big money. The market flattened out. Things drifted from bad to worse. And not only lost all I had, but got into debt again. More heavily than ever. Those were long, lean years. 1911, 1912, 1913, and 1914. There was no money to be made. The opportunity simply wasn't there, and so I was worse off than ever. It isn't uncomfortable to lose when the loss is not accompanied by a poignant vision of what might have been. That was precisely what I could not keep my mind from dwelling on. And of course, it unsettled me further. I learned that the weaknesses to which a speculator is prone are almost numberless. It was proper for me as a man to act the way I did in Dan Williamson's office, but it was improper and unwise for me as a speculator to allow myself to be influenced by any consideration to act against my own judgment. Noblesse oblige, but not in the stock market, because the tape is not chivalrous and, moreover, does not reward loyalty. I realized that I couldn't have acted differently. I couldn't make myself over just because I wished to trade in the stock market. But business is business always, and my business as a speculator is to back my own judgment always. It was a very curious experience. I'll tell you what I think happened. Dan Williamson was perfectly sincere in what he told me when he first saw me. Every time his firm did a few thousand shares in any one stock, the street jumped at the conclusion that Alvin Marquand was buying or selling. He was the big trader of the office, to be sure, and he gave this firm all his business, and he was one of the best and biggest traders they have ever had in Wall Street. Well, I was to be used as a smokescreen, particularly for Marquand's selling. Alvin Marquand fell sick shortly after I went in. His ailment was early diagnosed as incurable, and Dan Williamson, of course, knew it long before Marquand himself did. That is why Dan covered my Chesapeake and Atlantic stock. He had begun to liquidate some of his brother-in-law's speculative holdings of that and other stocks. Of course, when Marquand died, the estate had to liquidate his speculative and semi-speculative lines, and by that time, we had run into a bear market. By tying me up the way he did, Dan was helping the estate a whole lot. I do not speak boastfully when I say that I was a very heavy trader and that I was dead right in my views on the stock market. I know that Williamson remembered my successful operations in the bear market of 1907, and he couldn't afford to run the risk of having me at large. Why, if I had kept on the way I was going, I'd have made so much money that by the time he was trying to liquidate part of Alvin Marquand's estate, I would have been trading in hundreds of thousands of shares. As an active bear, I would have done damage running into the millions of dollars to the Marquand heirs, for Alvin left only a little over a couple of $100 million. It was much cheaper for them to let me get into debt, and then to pay off the debt, than to have me in some other office operating actively on the bear side. That is precisely what I would have been doing, but for my feeling that I must not be outdone in decency by Dan Williamson. I have always considered this the most interesting and most unfortunate of all my experiences as a stock operator. As a lesson, it cost me a disproportionately high price. It put off the time of my recovery several years. I was young enough to wait with patience for the strayed millions to come back. But 5 years is a long time for a man to be poor. Young or old, it is not to be relished. I could do without the yachts a great deal easier than I could without a market to come back on. The greatest opportunity of a lifetime was holding before my very nose the purse I had lost. I could not put out my hand and reach for it. A very shrewd boy, that Dan Williamson, as slick as they make them, far-sighted, ingenious, daring. He is a thinker, has imagination, detects the vulnerable spot in any man, and can plan cold-bloodedly to hit it. He did his own sizing up and soon doped out just what to do to me in order to reduce me to complete inoffensiveness in the market. He did not actually do me out of any money. On the contrary, he was to all appearances extremely nice about it. He loved his sister, Mrs. Marquand, and he did his duty toward her as he saw it. Chapter 14. It has always rankled in my mind that after I left Williamson and Brown's office, the cream was off the market. We ran smack into a long, moneyless period. 4 mighty lean years. There was not a penny to be made. As Billy Henriquez once said, it was the kind of market in which not even a skunk could make a cent. It looked to me as though I was in Dutch with destiny. It might have been the plan of Providence to chasten me, but really I had not been filled with such pride as called for a fall. I had not committed any of those speculative sins which a trader must expiate on the debtor side of the account. I was not guilty of a typical sucker play. What I had done, or rather, what I had left undone, was something for which I would have received praise and not blame, nor at the 42nd Street. In Wall Street, it was absurd and costly. But by far the worst thing about it was the tendency it had to make a man a little less inclined to permit himself human feelings in the ticker district. I left Williamson's and tried other brokers' offices. In every one of them, I lost money. It served me right, because I was trying to force the market into giving me what it didn't have to give. To wit, opportunities for making money. I did not find any trouble in getting credit, because those who knew me had faith in me. You can get an idea of how strong their confidence was when I tell you that when I finally stopped trading on credit, I owed well over $1 million. The trouble was not that I had lost my grip, but that during those 4 wretched years, the opportunities for making money simply didn't exist. Still, I plugged along, trying to make a stake and succeeding only in increasing my indebtedness. After I ceased trading on my own hook, because I wouldn't owe my friends any more money, I made a living handling accounts for people who believed I knew the game well enough to beat it even in a dull market. For my services, I received a percentage of the profits, when there were any. That is how I lived. Well, that is how I sustained life. Of course, I didn't always lose, but I never made enough to allow me materially to reduce what I owed. Finally, as things got worse, I felt the beginnings of discouragement for the first time in my life. Everything seemed to have gone wrong with me. I did not go about bewailing the descent from millions and yachts to debts and the simple life. I didn't enjoy the situation, but I did not fill up with self-pity. I did not propose to wait patiently for time and Providence to bring about the cessation of my discomforts. I therefore studied my problem. It was plain that the only way out of my troubles was by making money. To make money, I needed merely to trade successfully. I had so traded before, and I must do so once more. More than once in the past, I had run up a shoestring into hundreds of thousands. Sooner or later, the market would offer me an opportunity. I convinced myself that whatever was wrong with me and not with the market. Now, what could be the trouble with me? I asked myself that question in the same spirit in which I always study the various phases of my trading problems. I thought about it calmly and came to the conclusion that my main trouble came from worrying over the money I owed. I was never free from the mental discomfort of it. I must explain to you that it was not mere consciousness of my indebtedness. Any businessman contracts debts in the course of his regular business. Most of my debts were really nothing but business debts, due to what were unfavorable business conditions for me, and no worse than a merchant suffers from, for instance, when there is an unusually prolonged spell of unseasonable weather. Of course, as time went on and I could not pay, I began to feel less philosophical about my debts. I'll explain. I owed over $1 million. All of its stock market losses, remember. Most of my creditors were very nice and didn't bother me, but there were 2 who did bedevil me. They used to follow me around. Every time I made a winning, each of them was Johnny on the spot, wanting to know all about it and insisting on getting theirs right off. One of them, to whom I owed $800, threatened to sue me, seize my furniture, and so forth. I can't conceive why he thought I was concealing assets, unless it was that I didn't quite look like a stage hobo about to die of destitution. As I studied the problem, I saw that it wasn't a case that called for reading the tape, but for reading my own self. I quite cold-bloodedly reached the conclusion that I would never be able to accomplish anything useful so long as I was worried, and it was equally plain that I should be worried so long as I owed money. I mean, as long as any creditor had the power to vex me or to interfere with my coming back by insisting upon being paid before I could get a decent stake together. This was also obviously true that I said to myself, I must go through bankruptcy. What else could relieve my mind? It sounds both easy and sensible, doesn't it? But it was more than unpleasant, I can tell you. I hated to do it. I hated to put myself in a position to be misunderstood or misjudged. I myself never cared much for money. I never thought enough of it to consider it worthwhile lying for. But I knew that everybody didn't feel that way. Of course, I also knew that if I got on my feet again, I'd pay everybody off, for the obligation remained. But unless I was able to trade in the old way, I'd never be able to pay back that $1 million. I nerved myself and went to see my creditors. It was a mighty difficult thing for me to do, for all that most of them were personal friends or old acquaintances. I explained the situation quite frankly to them. I said, I am not going to take this step because I don't wish to pay you, but because, in justice to both myself and you, I must put myself in a position to make money. I have been thinking of this solution off and on for over 2 years, but I simply didn't have the nerve to come out and say so frankly to you. It would have been infinitely better for all of us if I had. It all simmers down to this. I positively cannot be my old self, while I am harassed or upset by these debts. I have decided to do now what I should have done a year ago. I have no other reason than the one I have just given you. What the first man said was, to all intents and purposes, what all of them said. He spoke for his firm. Livingston, he said, we understand. We realize your position perfectly. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll just give you a release. Have your lawyer prepare any kind of paper you wish, and we'll sign it. That was in substance what all my big creditors said. That is one side of Wall Street for you. Wasn't merely careless good nature or sportsmanship. It was also a mighty intelligent decision, for it was clearly good business. I appreciated both the goodwill and the business gumption. These creditors gave me a release on debts amounting to over $1 million. But there were the 2 minor creditors who wouldn't sign off. One of them was the $800 man I told you about. I also owed $60,000 to a brokerage firm which had gone into bankruptcy, and the receivers, who didn't know me from Adam, were on my neck early and late. Even if they had been disposed to follow the example set by my largest creditors, I don't suppose the court would have let them sign off. At all events, my schedule of bankruptcy amounted to only about $100,000, though, as I said, I owed well over $1 million. It was extremely disagreeable to see the story in the newspapers. I had always paid my debts in full, and this new experience was most mortifying to me. I knew I'd pay off everybody someday if I lived, but everybody who read the article wouldn't know it. I was ashamed to go out after I saw the report in the newspapers, but it all wore off presently, and I cannot tell you how intense was my feeling of relief to know that I wasn't going to be harried anymore by people who didn't understand how a man must give his entire mind to his business if he wishes to succeed in stock speculation. My mind now being free to take up trading with some prospect of success, unvexed by debts, the next step was to get another stake. The stock exchange had been closed from July 31st to the middle of December 1914, and Wall Street was in the dumps. There hadn't been any business whatever in a long time. I owed all my friends. I couldn't very well ask them to help me again just because they had been so pleasant and friendly to me, when I knew that nobody was in a position to do much for anybody. It was a mighty difficult task, getting a decent stake, for with the closing of the stock exchange there was nothing that I could ask any broker to do for me. I tried in a couple of places. No use. Finally, I went to see Dan Williamson. This was in February 1915. I had told him that I had rid myself of the mental incubus of debt and I was ready to trade as of old. You will recall that when he needed me, he offered me the use of $25,000 without my asking him. Now that I needed him, he said, when you see something that looks good to you and you want to buy 500 shares, go ahead and it will be all right. I thanked him and went away. He had kept me from making a great deal of money, and the office had made a lot in commissions for me. I admit I was a little sore to think that Williamson and Brown didn't give me a decent stake. I intended to trade conservatively at first. It would make my financial recovery easier and quicker if I could begin with a line a little better than 500 shares. But anyhow, I realized that such as it was, there was my chance to come back. I left Dan Williamson's office and studied the situation in general, and my own problem in particular. It was a bull market. That was as plain to me as it was to thousands of traders. But my stake consisted merely of an offer to carry 500 shares for me. That is, I had no leeway, limited as I was. I couldn't afford even a slight setback at the beginning. I must build up my stake with my very first play. That initial purchase of mine of 500 shares must be profitable. I had to make real money. I knew unless I had sufficient trading capital, I would not be able to use good judgment. Without adequate margins, it would be impossible to take the cold-blooded, dispassionate attitude toward the game that comes from the ability to afford a few minor losses, such as I often incurred in testing the market before putting down the big bet. I think now that I found myself then, at the most critical period of my career as a speculator. If I failed this time, there was no telling where or when, if ever, I might get another stake for another try. It was very clear that I simply must wait for the exact psychological moment. I didn't go near Williamson and Brown's. I purposely kept away from them for 6 long weeks of steady tape reading. I was afraid that if I went to the office, knowing that I could buy 500 shares, I might be tempted into trading at the wrong time or in the wrong stock. A trader, in addition to studying basic conditions, remembering market precedents, and keeping in mind the psychology of the outside public, as well as the limitations of his brokers, must also know himself and provide against his own weaknesses. There is no need to feel anger over being human. I have come to feel that it is as necessary to know how to read myself as to know how to read the tape. I have studied and reckoned on my own reactions to given impulses or to the inevitable temptations of an active market, quite in the same mood and spirit as I have considered crop conditions or analyzed reports of earnings. So day after day, broke and anxious to resume trading, I sat in front of a quotation board in another broker's office where I couldn't buy or sell as much as 1 share of stock, studying the market, not missing a single transaction on the tape, watching for the psychological moment to ring the full speed ahead bell. By reason of conditions known to the whole world, the stock I was most bullish on in those critical days of early 1915 was Bethlehem Steel. I was morally certain it was going way up, but in order to make sure that I would win on my very first play, as I must, I decided to wait until it crossed par. I think I have told you it has been my experience that whenever a stock crosses 100 or 200 or 300 for the first time, it nearly always keeps going up for 30 to 50 points, and after 300 faster than after 100 or 200. One of my first big coups was an Anaconda, which I bought when it crossed 200 and sold a day later at 260. My practice of buying a stock just after a cross par dated back to my early bucket shop days. It is an old trading principle. You can imagine how keen I was to get back to trading on my old scale. I was so eager to begin that I could not think of anything else, but I held myself in leash. I saw Bethlehem Steel climb every day, higher and higher, as I was sure it would, and yet there I was, checking my impulse to run over to Williamson and Brown's office and buy 500 shares. I knew I simply had to make my initial operation as nearly a cinch as was humanly possible. Every point that stock went up meant $500 I had not made. The first 10 points advance meant that I would have been able to pyramid, and instead of 500 shares, I might now be carrying 1,000 shares that would be earning for me $1,000 a point. But I sat tight, and instead of listening to my loud-mouthed hopes or to my clamorous beliefs, I heeded only the level voice of my experience and the counsel of common sense. Once I got a decent stake together, I could afford to take chances. But without a stake, taking chances, even slight chances, was a luxury utterly beyond my reach. 6 weeks of patience, but in the end, a victory for common sense over greed and hope. I really began to waver and sweat blood when the stock got up to 90. Think of what I had not made by not buying, when I was so bullish. Well, when it got to 98, I said to myself, Bethlehem is going to 100, and when it does, the roof is going to blow clean off. The tape said the same thing more than plainly. In fact, it used a megaphone. I tell you, I saw 100 on the tape when the ticker was only printing shouted 98. And I knew that wasn't the voice of my hope or the sight of my desire, but the assertion of my tape-reading instinct. So I said to myself, I can't wait until it gets through 100. I have to get it now. It is as good as gone through par. I rushed to Williamson and Brown's office and put in an order to buy 500 shares of Bethlehem Steel. The market was then 98. I got 500 shares at 98 to 99. After that, she shot right up and closed that night, I think, at 114 or 115. I bought 500 shares more. The next day, Bethlehem Steel was 145, and I had my stake. But I earned it. Those 6 weeks of waiting for the right moment were the most strenuous and wearing 6 weeks I ever put in. But it paid me, for I now had enough capital to trade in fair-sized lots. I never would have got anywhere just on 500 shares of stock. There is a great deal in starting right, whatever the enterprise may be, and I did very well after my Bethlehem deal. So well indeed, that you would not have believed it was the self-same man trading. As a matter of fact, it wasn't the same man. For where I had been harassed and wrong, I was now at ease and right. There were no creditors to annoy and no lack of funds to interfere with my thinking or with my listening to the truthful voice of experience, and so I was winning right along. All of a sudden, as I was on my way to a sure fortune, we had the Lusitania break. Every once in a while, a man gets a crack like that in the solar plexus. Probably that he may be reminded of the sad fact that no human being can be so uniformly right on the market as to be beyond the reach of unprofitable accidents. I have heard people say that no professional speculator need have been hit very hard by the news of the torpedoing of the Lusitania, and they go on to tell how they had it long before the street did. I was not clever enough to escape by means of advance information, and all I can tell you is that on account of what I lost through the Lusitania break and one or two other reverses that I wasn't wise enough to foresee, I found myself at the end of 1915 with a balance at my brokers of about $140,000. That was all I actually made, though I was consistently right on the market throughout the greater part of the year. I did much better during the following year. I was very lucky. I was rampantly bullish in a wild bull market. Things were certainly coming my way, so that there wasn't anything to do but to make money. It made me remember a saying of the late H. Rogers of the Standard Oil Company, to the effect that there were times when a man could no more help making money than he could help getting wet if he went out in a rainstorm without an umbrella. It was the most clearly defined bull market we ever had. It was plain to everybody that the Allied purchases of all kinds of supplies here made the United States the most prosperous nation in the world. We had all the things that no one else had for sale, and we were fast getting all the cash in the world. I mean that the wide world's gold was pouring into this country in torrents. Inflation was inevitable, and of course, that meant rising prices for everything. All this was so evident from the first that little or no manipulation for the rise was needed. That was the reason why the preliminary work was so much less than in other bull markets. And not only was the war bride boom more naturally developed than all others, but it proved unprecedentedly profitable for the general public. That is, the stock market winnings during 1915 were more widely distributed than in any other boom in the history of Wall Street. That the public did not turn all their paper profits into good hard cash, or that they did not long keep what profits they actually took, was merely history repeating itself. Nowhere does history indulge in repetition so often or so uniformly as in Wall Street. When you read contemporary accounts of booms or panics, the one thing that strikes you most forcibly is how little either stock speculation or stock speculators today differ from yesterday. The game does not change, and neither does human nature. I went along with the rise in 1916. I was as bullish as the next man, but of course, I kept my eyes open. I knew, as everybody did, that there must be an end, and I was on the watch for warning signals. I wasn't particularly interested in guessing from which quarter the tip would come, and so I didn't stare at just one spot. I was not, and I never have felt that I was, wedded indissolubly to one or the other side of the market. That a bull market is added to my bank account or a bear market has been particularly generous, I do not consider sufficient reason for sticking to the bull or the bear side after I receive the get-out warning. A man does not swear eternal allegiance to either the bull or the bear side. His concern lies with being right. And there is another thing to remember, and that is that a market does not culminate in one grand blaze of glory. Neither does it end with a sudden reversal of form. A market can, and does, often cease to be a bull market long before prices generally begin to break. My long-expected warning came to me when I noticed that one after another, those stocks which had been the leaders of the market reacted several points from the top and, for the first time in many months, did not come back. Their race evidently was run, and that clearly necessitated a change in my trading tactics. It was simple enough. In a bull market, the trend of prices, of course, is decidedly and definitely upward. Therefore, whenever a stock goes against the general trend, you are justified in assuming that there is something wrong with that particular stock. It is enough for the experienced trader to perceive that something is wrong. He must not expect the tape to become a lecturer. His job is to listen for it to say, "Get out," and not wait for it to submit a legal brief for approval. As I said before, I noticed that stocks which had been the leaders of the wonderful advance had ceased to advance. They dropped 6 or 7 points and stayed there. At the same time, the rest of the market kept on advancing under new standard bearers. Since nothing wrong had developed with the companies themselves, the reason had to be sought elsewhere. Those stocks had gone with the current for months. When they ceased to do so, though the bull tide was still running strong, it meant that for those particular stocks, the bull market was over. For the rest of the list, the tendency was still decidedly upward. There was no need to be perplexed into inactivity, for there were really no cross-currents. I did not turn bearish on the market then, because the tape didn't tell me to do so. The end of the bull market had not come, though it was within hailing distance. Pending its arrival, there was still bull money to be made. Such being the case, I merely turned bearish on the stocks which had stopped advancing, and as the rest of the market had rising power behind it, I both bought and sold. The leaders that had ceased to lead, I sold. I put out a short line of 5,000 shares in each of them, and then I went long of the new leaders. The stocks I was short of didn't do much, but my long stocks kept on rising. When finally these, in turn, ceased to advance, I sold them out and went short, 5,000 shares of each. By this time, I was more bearish than bullish, because obviously the next big money was going to be made on the downside, while I felt certain that the bear market had really begun before the bull market had really ended. I knew the time for being a rampant bear was not yet. There was no sense in being more royalist than the king, especially in being so too soon. The tape merely said that patrolling parties from the main bear army had dashed by. Time to get ready. I kept on both buying and selling until after about a month's trading, I had out a short line of 60,000 shares, 5,000 shares each in a dozen different stocks, which earlier in the year had been the public's favorites because they had been the leaders of the great bull market. It was not a very heavy line, but don't forget that neither was the market definitely bearish. Then one day the entire market became quite weak and prices of all stocks began to fall. When I had a profit of at least 4 points in each and every one of the 12 stocks that I was short of, I knew that I was right. The tape told me it was now safe to be bearish, so I promptly doubled up. I had my position. I was short of stocks in a market that now was plainly a bear market. There wasn't any need for me to push things along. The market was bound to go my way, and knowing that, I could afford to wait. After I doubled up, I didn't make another trade for a long time. About 7 weeks after I put out my full line, we had the famous leak, and stocks broke badly. It was said that somebody had advanced news from Washington that President Wilson was going to issue a message that would bring back the dove of peace to Europe in a hurry. Of course, the war bride boom was started and kept up by the World War, and peace was a bare item. When one of the cleverest traders on the floor was accused of profiting by advance information, he simply said he had sold stocks not on any news, but because he considered that the bull market was overripe. I myself had doubled my line of short 7 weeks before. On the news, the market broke badly, and I naturally covered. It was the only play possible. When something happens on which you did not count when you made your plans, it behooves you to utilize the opportunity that a kindly fate offers you. For one thing, on a bad break like that, you have a big market, one that you can turn around in, and that is the time to turn your paper profits into real money. Even in a bear market, a man cannot always cover 120,000 shares of stock without putting up the price on himself. He must wait for the market that will allow him to buy that much at no damage to his profit as it stands him on paper. I should like to point out that I was not counting on that particular break at that particular time for that particular reason. But, as I have told you before, my experience of 30 years as a trader is that such accidents are usually along the line of least resistance on which I base my position in the market. Another thing to bear in mind is this: never try to sell at the top. It isn't wise. Sell after a reaction if there is no rally. I cleared about $3 million in 1916 by being bullish as long as the bull market lasted, and then by being bearish when the bear market started. As I said before, a man does not have to marry one side of the market till death do them part. That winter I went south to Palm Beach, as I usually do for a vacation, because I am very fond of saltwater fishing. I was short of stocks and wheat, and both lines showed me a handsome profit. There wasn't anything to annoy me, and I was having a good time. Of course, unless I go to Europe, I cannot really be out of touch with the stock or commodities markets. For instance, in the Adirondacks, I have a direct wire from my broker's office to my house. In Palm Beach, I used to go to my broker's branch office regularly. I noticed that cotton, in which I had no interest, was strong and rising. About that time, this was in 1917, I heard a great deal about the efforts the President Wilson was making to bring about peace. The reports came from Washington, both in the shape of press dispatches and private advice to friends in Palm Beach. That is the reason why one day I got the notion that the course of the various markets reflected confidence in Mr. Wilson's success. With peace supposedly close at hand, stocks and wheat ought to go down and cotton up. I was all set as far as stocks and wheat went, but I had not done anything in cotton in some time. At 2:20 that afternoon, I did not own a single bale, but at 2:25, my belief that peace was impending made me buy 15,000 bales as a starter. I proposed to follow my old system of trading, that is, of buying my full line, which I have already described to you. That very afternoon, after the market closed, we got the unrestricted warfare note. There wasn't anything to do except to wait for the market to open the next day. I recall that at Gridley's that night, one of the greatest captains of industry in the country was offering to sell any amount of United States steel at 5 points below the closing price that afternoon. There were several Pittsburgh millionaires within hearing. Nobody took the big man's offer. They knew there was bound to be a whopping big break at the opening. Sure enough, the next morning the stock and commodity markets were in an uproar, as you can imagine. Some stocks opened 8 points below the previous night's close. To me, that meant a heaven-sent opportunity to cover all my shorts profitably. As I said before, in a bear market it is always wise to cover if complete demoralization suddenly develops. That is the only way, if you swing a good-sized line, of turning a big paper profit into real money both quickly and without regrettable reductions. For instance, I was short 50,000 shares of United States Steel alone. Of course, I was short of other stocks, and when I saw I had the market to cover in, I did. My profits amounted to about $1.5 million. It was not a chance to disregard. Cotton, of which I was long 15,000 bales, bought in the last half hour of the trading the previous afternoon, opened down 500 points. Some break. It meant an overnight loss of $375,000. While it was perfectly clear that the only wise play in stocks and wheat was to cover on the break, I was not so clear as to what I ought to do in cotton. There were various things to consider, and while I always take my loss the moment I am convinced I am wrong, I did not like to take that loss that morning. Then I reflected that I had gone south to have a good time fishing instead of perplexing myself over the course of the cotton market. And moreover, I had taken such big profits in my wheat and in stocks that I decided to take my loss in cotton. I would figure that my profit had been a little more than 1 million instead of over 1.5 million. It was all a matter of bookkeeping, as promoters are apt to tell you when you ask too many questions. If I hadn't bought that cotton just before the market closed the day before, I would have saved that $400,000. It shows you how quickly a man may lose big money on a moderate line. My main position was absolutely correct, and I benefited by an accident of a nature diametrically opposite to the considerations that led me to take the position I did in stocks and wheat. Observe, please, that the speculative line of least resistance again demonstrated its value to a trader. Prices went as I expected, notwithstanding the unexpected market factor introduced by the German note. If things had turned out as I had figured, I would have been 100% right in all three of my lines, for with peace stocks and wheat would have gone down and cotton would have gone kiting up. I would have cleaned up in all three. Irrespective of peace or war, I was right in my position on the stock market and in wheat, and that is why the unlooked-for event helped. In cotton, I based my play on something that might happen outside of the market. That is, I bet on Mr. Wilson's success in his peace negotiations. It was the German military leaders who made me lose the cotton bet. When I returned to New York early in 1917, I paid back all the money I owed, which was over $1 million. It was a great pleasure to me to pay my debts. I might have paid it back a few months earlier, but I didn't for a very simple reason. I was trading actively and successfully, and I needed all the capital I had. I owed it to myself, as well as to the men I considered my creditors, to take every advantage of the wonderful markets we had in 1915 and 1916. I knew that I would make a great deal of money, and I wasn't worrying because I was letting them wait a few months longer for money many of them never expected to get back. I did not wish to pay off my obligations in driblets, or to one man at a time, but in full to all at once. So as long as the market was doing all it could for me, I just kept on trading on as big a scale as my resources permitted. I wished to pay interest, but all those creditors who had signed releases positively refused to accept it. The man I paid off the last of all was the chap I owed the $800 to, who had made my life a burden and had upset me until I couldn't trade. I let him wait until he heard that I had paid off all the others. Then he got his money. I wanted to teach him to be considerate the next time somebody owed him a few hundreds. And that is how I came back. After I paid off my debts in full, I put a pretty fair amount into annuities. I made up my mind I wasn't going to be strapped and uncomfortable and minus a state ever again. Of course, after I married, I put some money in trust for my wife. And after the boy came, I put some in trust for him. The reason I did this was not alone the fear that the stock market might take it away from me, but because I knew that a man will spend anything he can lay his hands on. By doing what I did, my wife and child are safe from me. More than one man I know has done the same thing, but has coaxed his wife to sign off when he needed the money, and he has lost it. But I have fixed it up, so that no matter what I want or what my wife wants, that trust holds. It is absolutely safe from all attacks by either of us. Safe from my market needs, safe even from a devoted wife's love. I'm taking no chances. Chapter 15. Among the hazards of speculation, the happening of the unexpected, I might even say of the unexpectable, ranks high. There are certain chances that the most prudent man is justified in taking, chances that he must take if he wishes to be more than a mercantile mollusk. Normal business hazards are no worse than the risks a man runs when he goes out of his house into the street or sets out on a railroad journey. When I lose money by reason of some development which nobody could foresee, I think no more vindictively of it than I do of an inconveniently timed storm. Life itself, from the cradle to the grave, is a gamble, and what happens to me, because I do not possess the gift of second sight, I can bear undisturbed. But there have been times in my career as a speculator when I have both been right and played square, and nevertheless, I have been cheated out of my earnings by the sordid unfairness of unsportsmanlike opponents. Against misdeeds by crooks, cowards, and crowds, a quick-thinking or far-sighted businessman can protect himself. I have never gone up against downright dishonesty, except in a bucket shop or two, because even their honesty was the best policy. The big money was in being square and not in welshing. I have never thought it good business to play any game in any place where it was necessary to keep an eye on the dealer because he was likely to cheat if unwatched. But against the whining welsher, the decent man is powerless. Fair play is fair play. I could tell you a dozen instances where I've been the victim of my own belief in the sacredness of the pledged word or of the inviolability of a gentleman's agreement. I shall not do so, because no useful purpose can be served thereby. Fiction writers, clergymen, and women are fond of alluding to the floor of the stock exchange as a bootless battlefield and to Wall Street's daily business as a fight. It is quite dramatic, but utterly misleading. I do not think that my business is strife and contest. I never fight either individuals or speculative cliques. I merely differ in opinion. That is, in my reading of basic conditions. What playwrights call battles of business are not fights between human beings. They are merely tests of business vision. I try to stick to facts and facts only and govern my actions accordingly. That is Bernard M. Baruch's recipe for success in wealth winning. Sometimes, I do not see the facts, all the facts, clearly enough or early enough, or else I do not reason logically. Whenever any of these things happen, I lose. I am wrong, and it always costs me money to be wrong. No reasonable man objects to paying for his mistakes. There are no preferred creditors in mistake-making and no exceptions or exemptions. But I object to losing money when I am right. I do not mean either those deals that have cost me money because of sudden changes in the rules of some particular exchange. I have in mind certain hazards of speculation that from time to time remind a man that no profit should be counted safe until it is deposited in your bank to your credit. After the Great War broke out in Europe, there began the rise in the prices of commodities that was to be expected. It was as easy to foresee that as to foresee war inflation. Of course, the general advance continued as the war prolonged itself. As you may remember, I was busy coming back in 1915. The boom in stocks was there, and it was my duty to utilize it. My safest, easiest, and quickest big play was in the stock market, and I was lucky, as you know. By July 1917, I not only had been able to pay off all my debts, but was quite a little to the good besides. This meant that I now had the time, the money, and the inclination to consider trading in commodities as well as in stocks. For many years, I have made it my practice to study all the markets. The advance in commodity prices over the pre-war level ranged from 100 to 400%. There was only one exception, and that was coffee. Of course, there was a reason for this. The breaking out of the war meant the closing up of European markets, and huge cargoes were sent to this country, which was the one big market. That led in time to an enormous surplus of raw coffee here, and that in turn kept the price low. Why? When I first began to consider its speculative possibilities, coffee was actually selling below pre-war prices. If the reasons for this anomaly were plain, no less plain was it that the active and increasingly efficient operation by the German and Austrian submarines must mean an appalling reduction in the number of ships available for commercial purposes. This eventually, in turn, must lead to dwindling imports of coffee. With reduced receipts and an unchanged consumption, the surplus stocks must be absorbed. And when that happened, the price of coffee must do what the prices of all other commodities had done, which was go way up. It didn't require a Sherlock Holmes to size up the situation. Why everybody did not buy coffee, I cannot tell you. When I decided to buy it, I did not consider it a speculation. It was much more of an investment. I knew it would take time to cash in, but I knew also that it was bound to yield a good profit. That made it a conservative investment operation, a banker's act rather than a gambler's play. I started my buying operations in the winter of 1917. I took quite a lot of coffee. The market, however, did nothing to speak of. It continued inactive, and as for the price, it did not go up as I had expected. The outcome of it all was that I simply carried my line to no purpose for 9 long months. My contracts expired then, and I sold out all my options. I took a whopping big loss on that deal, and yet I was sure my views were sound. I had been clearly wrong in the matter of time, but I was confident that coffee must advance as all commodities had done, so that no sooner had I sold out my line than I started in to buy again. I bought 3 times as much coffee as I had so unprofitably carried during those 9 disappointing months. Of course, I bought deferred options, for as long a time as I could get. I was not so wrong now. As soon as I had taken on my trebled line, the market began to go up. People everywhere seemed to realize all of a sudden what was bound to happen in the coffee market. It began to look as if my investment was going to return me a mighty good rate of interest. The sellers of the contracts I held were roasters, mostly of German names and affiliations, who had bought the coffee in Brazil, confidently expecting to bring it to this country. But there were no ships to bring it, and presently they found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having no end of coffee down there and being heavily short of it to me up here. Please bear in mind that I first became bullish on coffee while the price was practically at a pre-war level, and don't forget that after I bought it, I carried it the greater part of a year and then took a big loss on it. The punishment for being wrong is to lose money. The reward for being right is to make money. Being clearly right and carrying a big line, I was justified in expecting to make a killing. It would not take much of an advance to make my profit satisfactory to me, for I was carrying several 100,000 bags. I don't like to talk about my operations in figures, because sometimes they sound rather formidable and people might think I was boasting. As a matter of fact, I trade in accordance to my means and always leave myself an ample margin of safety. In this instance, I was conservative enough. The reason I bought options so freely was because I couldn't see how I could lose. Conditions were in my favor. I had been made to wait a year, but now I was going to be paid both for my waiting and for being right. I could see the profit coming. Fast. There wasn't any cleverness about it. It was simply that I wasn't blind. Coming sure and fast, that profit of millions. But it never reached me. No, it wasn't sidetracked by a sudden change in conditions. The market did not experience an abrupt reversal of form. Coffee did not pour into the country. What happened? The unexpected. What had never happened in anybody's experience. What I therefore had no reason to guard against. I added a new one to the long list of hazards of speculation that I must always keep before me. It was simply that the fellows who had sold me the coffee, the shorts, knew what was in store for them, and in their efforts to squirm out of the position into which they had sold themselves, devised a new way of welshing. They rushed to Washington for help, and got it. Perhaps you remember that the government had evolved various plans for preventing further profiteering in necessities. You know how most of them worked. Well, the philanthropic coffee shorts appeared before the price-fixing committee of the War Industries Board. I think that was the official designation, and made a patriotic appeal to that body to protect the American breakfaster. They asserted that a professional speculator, one Lawrence Livingston, had cornered or was about to corner coffee. If his speculative plans were not brought to naught, he would take advantage of the conditions created by the war, and the American people would be forced to pay exorbitant prices for their daily coffee. It was unthinkable to the patriots who had sold me cargoes of coffee they couldn't find ships for, that 100 millions of Americans, more or less, should pay tribute to conscienceless speculators. They represented the coffee trade, not the coffee gamblers, and they were willing to help the government curb profiteering actual or prospective. Now I have a horror of whiners, and I do not mean to intimate that the price-fixing committee was not doing its honest best to curb profiteering and wastefulness. But that need not stop me from expressing the opinion that the committee could not have gone very deeply into the particular problem of the coffee market. They fixed on a maximum price for raw coffee, and also fixed a time limit for closing out all existing contracts. This decision meant, of course, that the coffee exchange would have to go out of business. There was only one thing for me to do, and I did it, and that was to sell out my contracts. Those profits of millions that I had deemed as certain to come my way as any I ever made, failed completely to materialize. I was, and am, as keen as anybody against the profiteer and the necessaries of life. But at the time, the price-fixing committee made their ruling on coffee. All other commodities were selling at from 250 to 400% above pre-war prices, while raw coffee was actually below the average prevailing for some years before the war. I can't see that it made any real difference who held the coffee. The price was bound to advance, and the reason for that was not the operations of conscienceless speculators, but the dwindling surplus for which the diminishing importations were responsible. and they in turn were affected exclusively by the appalling destruction of the world's ships by the German submarines. The committee did not wait for coffee to start. They clamped on the brakes. As a matter of policy and of expediency, it was a mistake to force the coffee exchange to close just then. If the committee had let coffee alone, the price undoubtedly would have risen for the reasons I have already stated, which had nothing to do with any alleged corner. But the high price, which need not have been exorbitant, would have been an incentive to attract supplies to this market. I have heard Mr. Bernard M. Baruch say that the War Industries Board took into consideration this factor, the ensuring of a supply, in fixing prices, and for that reason, some of the complaints about the high limit on certain commodities were unjust. When the coffee exchange resumed business, later on, coffee sold at 23 cents. The American people paid that price because of the small supply, and the supply was small because the price had been fixed too low at the suggestion of philanthropic shorts to make it possible to pay the high ocean freights and thus ensure continued importations. I have always thought that my coffee deal was the most legitimate of all my trades in commodities. I considered it more of an investment than a speculation. I was in it over a year. If there was any gambling, it was done by the patriotic roasters with German names and ancestry. They had coffee in Brazil, and they sold it to me in New York. The price-fixing committee fixed the price of the only commodity that had not advanced. They protected the public against profiteering before it started, but not against the inevitable higher prices that followed. Not only that, but even when green coffee hung around 9 cents a pound, roasted coffee went up with everything else. It was only the roasters who benefited. If the price of green coffee had gone up 2 or 3 cents a pound, it would have meant several millions for me, and it wouldn't have cost the public as much as the later advance did. Post-mortems and speculation are a waste of time. They get you nowhere. But this particular deal has a certain educational value. It was as pretty as any I ever went into. The rise was so sure, so logical, that I figured that I simply couldn't help making several millions of dollars. But I didn't. On 2 other occasions, I have suffered from the action of exchange committees making rulings that changed trading rules without warning. But in those cases, my own position, while technically right, was not quite so sound commercially as in my coffee trade. You cannot be dead sure of anything in a speculative operation. It was the experience I have just told you that made me add the unexpectable to the unexpected in my list of hazards. After the coffee episode, I was so successful in other commodities and on the short side of the stock market that I began to suffer from silly gossip. The professionals in Wall Street and the newspaper writers got the habit of blaming me and my alleged raids for the inevitable breaks in prices. At times, my selling was called unpatriotic, whether I was really selling or not. The reason for exaggerating the magnitude and the effect of my operations, I suppose, was the need to satisfy the public's insatiable demand for reasons for each and every price movement. As I have said 1,000 times, no manipulation can put stocks down and keep them down. There is nothing mysterious about this. The reason is plain to everybody who will take the trouble to think about it half a minute. Suppose an operator rated a stock, that is, put the price down to a level below its real value. What would inevitably happen? Why, the rater would at once be up against the best kind of inside buying. The people who know what a stock is worth will always buy it when it is selling at bargain prices. If the insiders are not able to buy, it will be because general conditions are against their free command of their own resources, and such conditions are not bull conditions. When people speak about raids, the inference is that the raids are unjustified, almost criminal. But selling a stock down to a price much below what it is worth is mighty dangerous business. It is well to bear in mind that a rated stock that fails to rally is not getting much inside buying, and where there is a raid, that is, unjustified short selling, there is usually apt to be inside buying. And when there is that, the price does not stay down. I should say that in 99 cases out of 100, so-called raids are really legitimate declines, accelerated at times, but not primarily caused by the operations of a professional trader, however big a line he may be able to swing. The theory that most of the sudden declines or particular sharp breaks are the results of some plunger's operations probably was invented as an easy way of supplying reasons to those speculators who, being nothing but blind gamblers, would believe anything that is told them, rather than do a little thinking. The rate excuse for losses that unfortunate speculators so often receive from brokers and financial gossipers is really an inverted tip. The difference lies in this. A bear tip is distinct, positive advice to sell short. But the inverted tip, that is, the explanation that does not explain, serves merely to keep you from wisely selling short. The natural tendency when a stock breaks badly is to sell it. There is a reason, an unknown reason, but a good reason. Therefore, get out. But it is not wise to get out when the break is the result of a raid by an operator, because the moment he stops, the price must rebound. Inverted tips.